Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are so happy to have you join us for the second day of our Residential Retrofits for Energy Equity Summit. I am looking forward to a day of connections and connecting the dots. My name is Annika Brindle. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Director of Residential Retrofits for Energy Equity with ACEEE. I am joining you from Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is Dakota and Anishinaabe land. As today's host, my job is to move us from session to session and make sure things are running smoothly for day 2 of the summit. First, we will have a word from our interpreters. Then I will go over some housekeeping announcements, and then I will hand things over to Daryl Wright of Emerald Cities Collaborative to kick us off for the day. Anna, I'll pass it to you to explain how our Spanish language interpretation will work today.
Thank you. Hello, good morning. I am Ana Vidales and Jordi Vidales. We're going to be your interpreters this day. So we're going to explain how this works. So if you want to hear Spanish interpretation, somebody participates in Spanish and you want to hear simultaneously in English, then you go to this little world icon that says interpretation. You pick English. There's an option to put mute original audio. That way you're just going to hear the interpreter. If you leave it open, you'll hear the interpreter at an 80% and the speaker at a 20%. This is if you're joining us through your computer. If you're joining us through an iPad or a phone, then you have to access the interpretation function clicking on these 3 little dots. You go to more, you go to interpretation, you pick your language of preference. Then you also have the option to mute original audio. And it's very important that once you pick your language of preference, you press done. Buenos días, yo soy Ana Vidales y Jordi Vidales. Vamos a ser sus intérpretes este día. Para poder escuchar esta presentación en español, ustedes tienen que ir al icono mundial que dice interpretación y elegir su idioma de preferencia. Cuando ustedes elijan español, está la opción también de silenciar el audio original. Si ustedes lo silencian, entonces van a escuchar al intérprete a un 100%. Si lo dejan abierto, entonces van a escuchar al intérprete a un 80% y al ponente principal a un 20%. Esto es si ustedes se están uniendo a la cumbre por medio de su computadora. Si ustedes están uniéndose por medio de un iPad o un teléfono, entonces tienen que ir a los 3 puntitos que dicen More, van a Interpretación. Nuevamente eligen su idioma de preferencia. También les está la opción de silenciar el audio original. Y es bien importante que una vez ustedes hayan elegido todo, aprieten Done para que se active la función. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you. You can activate interpretation now.
Thank you, Anna. Next, I would like to express thanks to our funders for their support of R2E2 and for making this. Our funders are the Rockefeller Foundation, JP Morgan Chase Foundation, the JPB Foundation, and Wells Fargo Foundation. Now, a few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. Attendees are in listen-only mode. You can turn on your video. Please use the chat feature on the bottom bar of your screen to ask questions of the presenters. We will have time for Q&A at the end of each session when questions from the chat will be answered as best presenters are able. If you prefer to ask a question or share verbally, you can raise your hand using the reactions feature, also located on the bottom bar. If chosen, you'll be prompted to unmute. However, I encourage you to utilize the chat as your first line of communication, as we will not always be able to call on folks with their hands raised. All presentation recordings, slides, and the attendee directory will be emailed to you after the summit. If you applied for the stipend for community-based organizations, we will contact you after the summit. Stipend availability may be limited based on demand. If at some point you leave the summit and are unable to get back in, it is possible that we have met our attendance cap of 1,000 participants. In that case, check your email for instructions on how to access the live stream of the summit on YouTube. And now I will hand it over to Daryl Wright with our partner Emerald Cities Collaborative for some opening comments.
Thanks, Annika. I'm Daryl Wright, Chief Strategy Officer at the Emerald Cities Collaborative. I use he, him pronouns, and am speaking with you from Wampanoag and Shawmut Land in Boston, Massachusetts. The Emerald Cities Collaborative is pleased to lend its expertise on economic inclusion, workforce development, labor standards, and community benefits agreements to the valuable work of the R2E2 initiative, residential retrofits for energy equity. It's a new nationwide initiative that will provide training to state, local, and tribal governments, as well as community-based organizations and other partners to jumpstart energy upgrades for affordable housing that will lower utility bills, reduce greenhouse gases emissions, improve citizens' health, create good-paying local jobs, and help advance racial equity. This summit is the kickoff of the R2E2 initiative. Please hashtag us on social media using hashtag R2E2 as you're posting about attending this summit. By the end of today, you'd have heard from a number of partnered organizations and also some of our strategic advisors. Yesterday, we heard from our keynote speaker, Delmar Gillis of Elevate, about equity and access to clean energy and energy efficiency for marginalized communities. We got an introduction to building retrofits and the multiple benefits for people and communities. We took time to connect and learn from one another during our peer exchange. And we got an overview of the complex landscape of affordable housing and energy efficiency stakeholders to get us thinking about building multi-stakeholder coalitions. And we heard from 6 amazing panelists from community-based organizations across the country about their experiences collaborating on housing, energy, and health-related projects. Today, day 2 of the summit, we will kick off with an in-depth session on federal funding opportunities that can be leveraged to support building upgrades. We'll then have another opportunity for peer exchange, and we'll round out the summit with an in-depth session on community-driven planning, a key element for successful planning and implementing retrofits that maximize the benefits to residents as well as communities. But before we get started with our federal funding session, we'll have a special announcement from the Department of Energy. Carolyn, over to you.
Thank you, Daryl, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carolyn Snyder, and I am the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Efficiency at the U.S. Department of Energy. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak at this important summit and to thank our R2E2 partners for your leadership. And thanks to all of you for making the time to engage on these very important and very relevant topics today. It's my pleasure to be here as we continue to explore ideas and how best to leverage historic funding sources to equitably transform existing buildings into more energy efficient and clean energy ready across our nation's homes, commercial spaces, and communities. Upgrading existing buildings will help reduce carbon emissions and energy costs and addressing energy burdens, while also improving indoor air quality, occupant comfort, and health. And we have the technologies to do it. We have efficient electric equipment like heat pumps and heat pump water heaters, and building efficiency measures such as insulation and air sealing. And now with the rebates and incentives in recent federal legislation, combined with the billions of dollars spent by utilities and municipalities each year, building upgrades are more affordable than ever. And yet, only about 1 or 2% of our country buildings are retrofitted for energy upgrades each year. And that's simply just not fast enough to meet our 2035 and 2050 climate goals, as well as important energy equity goals. To meet the Biden administration's ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals, existing buildings across a wide variety of uses, sizes, ages, and climates must be upgraded at a scale and pace we have never seen before. And to meet or exceed the administration's Justice 40 commitments, we must keep equity in the forefront as we do so. To get there, we need to address the persistent financial, social, administrative, and other barriers that challenge us to complete building upgrades equitably and at the scale that's needed. It's not going to be easy, but we at DOE are right there with you in this challenging endeavor. So with that, I'm going to quickly share a slide, because on Wednesday of this week, we were thrilled to have Secretary Granholm publicly announce our new Buildings Upgrade Prize, or Buildings Up as we call it. Buildings Up is a multi-phase prize from the American-made program funded by DOE's Building Technologies Office, and it's administered by our National Renewable Energy Lab. And the goal of the prize is to accelerate the deployment of equitable, widespread energy efficiency and efficient electrification upgrades in existing buildings across our country. In phase 1 of Buildings Up, we will award more than $22 million in cash prizes and expert technical assistance to support these transformative building upgrades initiatives. Buildings Up invites community-based organizations, state and local governments, Indian tribes, building owners, utilities, nonprofits, and other organizations. Basically, all of you participating in the summit today to team up and apply through one of 2 pathways we have identified. Phase 1, winning teams on the equity-centered innovation pathway will focus on delivering upgrades to low and moderate income homes, small disadvantaged businesses, and other equity eligible buildings, and will receive a $400,000 cash prize. Phase 1 winning teams on the open innovation pathway will receive a $200,000 cash prize. The prize funding can be used to pay for capacity building and for dedicated staff in your organizations and communities to focus on developing innovative upgrade initiatives that can leverage this historic federal funding, as well as ongoing increases in state, utility, and municipal funding. The prize can also pay for community engagement efforts to understand and respond to the needs of the building occupants we hope to reach with these upgrades. Subsequent phases of the prize are envisioned to offer additional significant funding subject to the availability of funds, and teams. The goal is to have teams have a runway for getting their initiatives off the ground year over year. Winning teams from both pathways will have access to an ecosystem of expert technical assistance and coaching to help bring their ideas to life. Winning teams will not only receive technical assistance you might traditionally expect from the Department of Energy, but also assistance with things like working with community partners to develop upgrade initiatives that truly meet the needs of building occupants and communities. Braiding funding from multiple sources to pay for upgrades in low-income households, connecting with and leveraging philanthropic support, developing communication materials, building an inclusive local workforce to complete these upgrades, and even facilitation support. Each winning team will also have a regional navigator who will meet with them regularly and help guide them to the right technical assistance at the right time for their innovations. And perhaps most importantly, winning teams will be part of the Buildings Up network, where they can learn from experts and from each other. I love all the peer exchange in the summit yesterday and today. And in this prize and in the climate challenge more broadly, we have to all work together, sharing ideas, coming up with new innovations, and building on the best ideas of each other to go farther and faster. Buildings Up is not designed as a competition, but as a co-opetition. So let's all get cooperating together. Phase 1 applications are opening on February 18th and are due by July 18th. We're especially pleased to work with ACEEE and the R2E2 partners, who will be offering various types of capacity building support to building up applicants during this phase 1 application period. And that includes training and technical assistance. And if the idea of filling out an application for federal funding seems daunting or new to you, or you've been unsuccessful applying for funding in the past, don't worry, we've got you. We want to have new and different organizations competing and generating new ideas. And that's why Building Up includes an application support bonus prize for new and under-resourced teams. Qualifying teams can apply for one of 50 prizes that includes $5,000 as well as 10 hours of technical assistance to help them complete a phase 1 submission. The application support prize is open now and will be awarded on a rolling basis until funds are expended. You can learn more about our Buildings Upgrade Prize during our first informational webinar that's going to be held on Thursday, February 2nd at noon Eastern Time. Please follow the Buildings Upgrade Prize on herox.com to register and to receive prize-related updates. You can go there right now, grab the QR code on this slide with your smartphone to take you right there, or type in the URL. We're very excited about this prize. It's designed to bring new ideas, new faces, new organizations, new communities into the nationwide effort to decarbonize our nation's nearly 130 million buildings, but to equitably decarbonize those buildings. And it's our hope that the Buildings Upgrade Prize will be helpful to you and your partners and your communities to play an even more impactful role in rapidly accelerating a just and equitable clean energy transition for all Americans. I am so excited to see the innovations that will be developed by our prize winners. And with that, thank you so much. And back to you, Daryl.
Thank you, Carolyn. That's exciting news. R2E2 is pleased to assist DOE with the Buildings Upgrade Prize by providing training and technical assistance to applicants and awardees. We look forward to the possibility of supporting some of you who are here today through this opportunity. Thank you. So I am now going to give you back to our your capable MC, Annika.
Thank you, Daryl, for getting us started, and Carolyn for that exciting announcement. Much more to come on the Buildings Upgrade Prize. Now I will turn it over to our first speakers of the day, Jamal Lewis of Rewiring America and Stephanie Sosa-Coulter of ACEEE, to present their session on leveraging federal funding for affordable housing upgrades. Throughout the presentation, please put your questions in the chat and we will keep track of them for Q&A at the end. Over to you, Jamal and Stephanie.
Thank you, Annika. So I'm just gonna pull up my presentation. Can you see my presentation without any issues?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So good afternoon or good morning, wherever in the country you are. My name is Stephanie Sosa-Coulter. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Deputy Director for R2E2 at ACEEE. So I want to start off by saying that there are so many different types of funding sources available, especially with the influx of funding from new bills that have been passed by the federal government. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to take advantage of these funds for energy-efficient building upgrades. The learning objectives for today's session include understanding the importance of upgrades for low-income households and the impact it has on communities. A thorough understanding of how new federal funding programs coming out of the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, IIJA, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. This is truly alphabet soup, but I promise we're going to try our best to make the acronyms as clear as possible as we speak. Also, embedded throughout this session, we will identify challenges and limitations that may exist when trying to leverage these dollars, as many of these dollars have various uses, are allocated to different agencies, budgeted differently by each state, and have a different timeline attached to them. Before we get into the details of each bill, I'd like to set the stage about why building upgrades in low-income communities are so important, and why we must ensure that this once-in-a-lifetime funding opportunity reaches the communities that need it the most. The most obvious answer is, on a larger scale, energy efficiency projects reduce greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution and lessen reliance on fossil fuel equipment. There are so many benefits, though, including improving the health, comfort, and safety of households, such as reducing exposure to mold, moisture, and lead, improving indoor air quality, and reducing visits to the emergency room and missed days of school and work due to asthma and other respiratory diseases. Building upgrades can also help reduce energy burden, such as reducing energy bills and improving long-term affordability and stability for low-income households, and also strengthening the local economy by creating jobs. I'd like to share some data points that simply prove the point that I'm trying to make. The median energy burden for low-income households is 3.5 times higher than non-low-income households. And the energy burden of Black households is 45% higher than non-Hispanic white households. We are hoping that through sharing this information, we are ensuring that these federal funding opportunities are reaching communities that have been excluded from past policies. Money is power, and once we know how to access it, we can continue to holistically address the priorities of marginalized communities. Now, on to the nitty-gritty and why you're here today. The American Rescue Plan Act is a $1.9 trillion stimulus bill that was signed into law in March 2021 to assist the country's recovery from the economic and health effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. The bill has a specific funding source called the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, or SLFRF. $350 billion were allocated to state, local, and tribal governments across the United States to support the recovery from the COVID-19 public health emergency. The federal government tried to be as lenient as possible when producing the rules for this funding, meaning that the funding has a range of uses. And of course, I'm focusing on energy efficiency and housing today. So some of those uses include affordable housing interventions, such as rehabilitation and preservation of affordable housing. And that also includes repairs and weatherization. So there is still funding available, Funding was allocated to each state, counties, metropolitan cities, tribal governments, territories, and non-entitlement units of local government. About 60.5% of the funding has been budgeted, and that means that the uses for the funding have already been committed for a specific use, but not necessarily spent. All the funds must be budgeted by December 31st, 2024. So there's still time to find out how your state or locality is using the funds and how you can take advantage of it. You can also visit the Treasury website, which is linked in the resources section of this presentation, to find out more about this funding. So I wanted to include this very cool tool that was designed by the National League of Cities, which is tracking how ARPA funds are being invested. It is live on their website, and you can see how funding continues to be used over time. So far, about 330 local governments are being tracked by the National League of Cities, and there are 7,527 projects being worked on, and about $39.3 billion that have been used. And of course, as you look at this, it's not all for like energy efficiency and housing projects, but you can see what the breakdown is here and what the priorities of cities have been with this funding. So I wanted to share a case study of how these funds are being used, and I wanted to highlight Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, also known as Connecticut DEEP. On April of 2021, Connecticut put forward the Connecticut Plan for the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. To quote the plan directly, this is a roadmap for a transformative, equitable, and healthy recovery for the state. The plan includes how they budgeted ARPA funding for various initiatives, including COVID-19 testing and vaccinations, broadband, education, economic growth, and of course, energy efficiency. And like I said earlier, the funding can be used for many different purposes. Connecticut DEEP allocated $7 million over 3 years to the Health and Safety Barrier Remediation Program, which is set to serve approximately 875 homes. This program will address home and safety barriers such as asbestos, mold, and gas leaks that have prevented households from doing weatherization work in their homes, which accounts for about 30% of the households in Connecticut. The program is expected to unlock over $1 million in home energy solutions utility co-investment for weatherization services, which will have a $1.6 million lifetime energy savings for income eligible households, which is rather impressive. Connecticut DEEP is also going to leverage funding incentives to work in conjunction with this plan, such as weatherization assistance program funding, and working with green banks and the Connecticut Finance Authority and other state agencies. Now that IIJA and IRA are out, who knows how else they are planning on reaching their goals. So now to wrap up on ARPA funding, I'd like to turn it to all of you and learn a bit more about your experiences and knowledge of ARPA funding. If you are familiar with any energy and housing projects or initiatives in your community that are using ARPA dollars, can you share some examples in the chat? Please take about a minute or so to respond, and you can have conversations in the chat as we transition over to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And I can't see the chat, but I believe that someone will be putting the question in the chat so you can refer back to it when you're trying to answer. So now moving on to the second bill of the day, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as IIJA. It is a $1.2 trillion bill that was signed into law to help grow the economy, create jobs, and make the economy more sustainable, resilient, and just. Various energy efficiency programs were allocated funding through this bill, including appropriations for the Weatherization Assistance Program, WAP, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, the State Energy Program, Energy Efficiency Revolving Loan Capitalization Grant Program, and the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Grant. Funding is still available for programs. Of course, funding amounts range by state, and some of the budgeting dates for some programs has already passed. Each agency that manages the funding has information with specific dates and allocation amounts on their websites. And of course, the resource section of this PowerPoint has that information. So IIJA allocated $3.5 billion to allow states to retrofit thousands of low-income homes to make them healthier and more energy efficient. The Weatherization Assistance Program funding allocation is dependent on a formula created by the federal government. So I would check in with your local governments and weatherization programs for more information about funding availability. Then we have the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, where $550 million were allocated to provide assistance to reduce the costs associated with home energy bills, energy crises, weatherization, and minor energy-related home repairs. I also want to know LIHEAP can also help fund the Weatherization Assistance Program. 90% of LIHEAP funding was obligated in 2022, but the remaining 10% were carried over into fiscal year 2023. IIJA allocated $500 million to the state energy program to states and territories to enhance security, advance state-led energy initiatives, and maximize the benefits of energy efficiency. And there's also a technical assistance piece attached to that funding. Also, under the state energy program, IIJA allocated $250 million to the Energy Efficiency Revolving Loan Fund Capitalization Grant Program to state and territorial energy offices to capitalize revolving loan funds to conduct audits and finance energy efficiency improvements in residential and commercial building sectors. The deadline for states to apply for funding, it goes through through April 21st of 2023 through the Department of Energy. Lastly, IIJA allocated $550 million in energy efficiency and conservation block grants to cities, communities, states, U.S. territories, and Indian tribes to develop, promote, implement, and manage energy efficiency, renewable energy conservation, and zero emission transportation projects. About 98% of the funding was allocated via formula, like most funding for IIJA, but about $8 million will be available via competitive process. And applications were actually due earlier in January. I believe it was January 13th. But if you'd like to learn more about how to access and use EECBG funds, the Department of Energy will be hosting an introduction series for states, local governments, and tribal governments. I think the first one takes place on January 25th. You can search it on the DOE website, but I've also included the link with the specific dates and sign up on the resource section of this presentation. So I have another prompt for you regarding IIJA. And again, the question will be posted in the chat as we transition to the next bill. So the question is, how does your state local government plan to use IIJA funding for energy efficiency projects in your community? Or how would you like to see this funding be spent on energy efficiency projects? And definitely feel free to answer both questions or one of the questions. And hopefully this sparks a great conversation between all of the participants. So I will pass it on to Jamal to introduce himself and to speak about the Inflation Reduction Act.
Hi everyone. My name is Jamal Lewis. I am on the policy team at Rewiring America. We are the nation's leading electrification advocate. We believe that through electrification, we can achieve efficiency, we can achieve pollution reduction, and we can create healthier homes in the process. I think earlier in the chat, I saw some folks who are also from Prince George's County. I am born and raised in Prince George's County. I currently live in DC, but it's really good to see some folks from my home county on here. I'm going to be talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, which many of you probably at this point already know about, or at least know exists. The Inflation Reduction Act is a landmark piece of legislation, which was signed towards the end of the summer last year, and was designed to help pay down the national debt, lower energy costs, and provide some healthcare benefits as well. The bill created a lot of resources for energy upgrades as well, which is what we're going to talk about. In total, there's about $369 billion for energy security and addressing climate change. And what does that mean? It means promoting and devoting resources towards energy efficiency, energy affordability, decarbonization, as well as electrification. In terms of funding, since the bill just passed, there is funding available now, which we'll talk about through the tax credits, but there is going to be a lot more funding hitting the streets at some point this year, potentially into next year as well. Before we go, in the Inflation Reduction Act, of the $369 billion, there's about $60 billion, specifically for disadvantaged communities of various types. And just to add some additional context, I know we've talked a lot about weatherization, we're talking about energy efficiency. This bill will help to spur and create a more sustainable market for a lot of those upgrades. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more. But because a lot of the resources in the bill are either uncapped through tax credits or designed to be leveraged with other resources, we're expecting that the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act's energy and climate spending will vastly exceed the $369 billion. In fact, we did a calculation estimating that the incentives in the bill could spur up to $858 billion in electrification and energy efficiency benefits to residential and to communities across the country. And so we're going to learn a little bit more about that today. Next slide. There's a lot in the bill. And so we're only going to cover a few, otherwise we'd be here forever. But we're going to cover the consumer rebates that are designed to lower the cost of energy efficiency and electrification upgrades. And that is the top two rows here. We're also going to talk about consumer tax credits, which are the next two, the 25C and 25D. We're going to talk about the funding for affordable housing, which includes the 45L tax credit, as well as the Green and Resilient Retrofit program. And then we're going to talk about broader sources of funding for pollution reduction, and those are those bottom three. I don't think we included it here. We're also going to talk about the 179D tax deduction, which is largely for commercial properties, but also includes affordable housing as well as part of that. You can see on here the amounts. When I talked about that, we think that the Inflation Reduction Act is going to spur a lot more impact than the $369 billion. Part of that is because these tax credits are uncapped. So, those are 10 years, and we have slides specifically on those. But there's no limit to the amount of uptake of those tax credits. So the impact is really unlimited of those specific resources. Next slide. So beginning with the consumer rebates, we're going to talk about both the high efficiency electric home rebates program, otherwise known as the home electrification rebate. These are incentives specifically for electrification, so switching to efficient electric appliances. And you can see a list of those on the right here of the slide. This program received $4.5 billion from Congress. That right now, the Department of Energy is working to develop guidelines and rules for the program. The way that a lot of folks will interact with this program is through the State Energy Office. These are the same offices that oftentimes administer the State Energy Program, which Stephanie talked about, or the weatherization program. And so those are the entities that are going to be administering this program sort of on the ground. The electrification rebates are point of sale, which means, when you typically think about a rebate, you're thinking, I think about having to put forth upfront capital and then receive a rebate maybe in the mail, 2 or 3 weeks later. That is not what this is. These are point of sale. So the intent is for when the purchase is being made, there's an upfront discount taken off the top. A household can receive up to $14,000 in an upfront rebate for qualifying electric upgrade projects. This program is entirely income qualified. So households that make at or below 150% of the area median income are eligible. In terms of the amount of incentives, households that make below 80% of the area median income, which is a term that HUD often uses to determine income eligibility in different areas, recognizing that the average income in New York City is going to be different than the average income maybe in Durham, North Carolina. So the area median income metric is designed to account for that. Those households making below 80% of area median income are eligible for for 100% of the cost covered up to $14,000. And that $14,000 is coming from those like sub maxes here on the right. Households making between 80 and 150% of area median income are eligible for 50% of the cost covered, up to $14,000. Multifamily buildings also qualify, and they qualify only if at or greater than 50% of the occupants are low and moderate income, defined by below 150% of area median income. And the max is $14,000 per unit. There is also a contractor incentive here. So there's a $500 contractor incentive for installing a qualified electrification product. That's what the QEP stands for. So in terms of timeline, there's a process for developing this program. The Department of Energy just released this week a public comment period on this program that is open through March 3rd, I believe. And the idea is, a program of this size and magnitude needs public comment. We need, they need people to tell them how we think that it should be implemented. And so if you are interested in weighing in, definitely encourage you to do so. After March 3rd, there will be a process where DOE is going to develop guidelines and rules for this program, which will take some time. And then after that, state energy offices actually have to apply for this funding. So there will be a request for proposals from the Department of Energy, and then states will apply for that. And then DOE will then have to approve that plan. There are some requirements of that plan, which includes like how state energy offices plan to verify income at point of sale. But all of that takes time. So the process of putting together guidelines, the process of states applying and the DOE approving takes time. So I think at this point, the timing of this is probably looking more like late 2023 for when these rebates will actually be able to hit the streets. But but that timeline may shift more, if things happen quicker, or maybe may happen a bit longer if like there are hiccups along the way. So that's it for this consumer rebate program. Next slide. The next consumer rebate program is this home energy performance-based whole house rebate program, also known as the whole home efficiency rebates. This is a similar program where it incentivizes energy upgrades, but for energy efficiency. So you can think of the electrification rebates as, switching to electric appliances. The efficiency rebates are, incentivizing measures that improve efficient household efficiency. So there's $4.3 billion available for this program, also going to be administered by state energy offices and tribes. And sorry, one thing I should note about the electrification rebates, there is a set aside for tribes and tribal organizations of about $200 million. So as state energy offices are receiving funds, there's also a pot of funding for tribes. And if you are a tribe or work with tribes, I think it's really important that you weigh in on the implementation of that set aside. Both the whole home efficiency rebates and the electrification rebates are going to be deployed to states through a formula. And you can find out how much your state's getting. The Department of Energy released it about a month ago. But for tribes, it's not a formula, I think so. I think they need a little bit of feedback in terms of, how should that pot of funds be implemented. So that's, I think, a really important point. Similar for this program in terms of timing, it's the same process. And actually DOE's sort of lumping both of these rebate programs together, recognizing that the average household is not going to, recognize or care about the difference. But it's the same process: guidelines, state applications, DOE approval, and then states having the ability to just deploy these resources. So what are these rebates? Unfortunately, this program, these rebates are not point of sale. And part of the reason is because they are based on energy savings. So retrofits that achieve at least 15% of energy savings are eligible for a rebate. And this does include things like heat pumps and other electrification measures. There are two pathways here for getting a rebate. There is a modeled energy savings pathway, which is a little clearer. Still, I think there's a lot to be worked out with this program specifically. But essentially, a consumer or sort of an aggregator, an entity that is, maybe going to be improving multiple buildings at once, can use a modeling software that already exists, or maybe a new one that's being developed now, to project how much energy is going to be saved with those with the retrofit measures that they're thinking about installing. For low and moderate income households, the energy savings cap is $8,000, which is or up to 80% of project costs. And for other properties or other non-low income households, there's a $4,000 cap. This is a projection, and so it does take, I think, some level of sophistication to project that in that sort of navigate modeling software. There is also a measured energy savings pathway. So you can think about it, after you retrofit your home, you then calculate exactly what energy you're saving. And because of that, or through that calculation, you'll be eligible for energy savings that way. There's a lot to figure out with this program, so stay tuned. with the last two things that I'll mention, that multifamily buildings are definitely eligible. And there's a $200 contractor incentive for retrofit projects that occur in disadvantaged communities. And just one thing to note, a lot of these programs do include, the Inflation Reduction Act is the first bill to ever include terms like disadvantaged communities. And it shows up in various programs administered by DOE, EPA. And I think all of these agencies are trying to figure out how they are going to define that. So it's not clear how they're defining disadvantaged communities. But I think the good thing is that term is in the text. And so there is a statutory requirement to serve these communities, which we know, there's a wide variety of these types of communities that need various assistance. And this will help to, add a little level of accountability in serving these communities that have long been disinvested in and underserved. Next slide. So moving on to the tax credits, there are two consumer-facing tax credits that I want to point out. 25C, which is for, you can think about the 25C tax credit as like appliances or other like energy efficiency measures. The 25D tax credit is largely for like on-site energy production. So solar, geothermal heat pumps, battery storage. For 25C, things like heat pumps, electric heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, also insulation, door and window replacement. And these are tax credits. So, and that just became online January 1st of this year. So any upgrade, any of those upgrades that you make this year in 2023, assuming that you have sufficient tax liability, can claim a tax credit when you file your taxes in 2024. The 25C tax credit, both tax credits were existing and have been extended through 2031. For the 25C tax credit, again, it's for heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, and like electrical panel upgrades, insulation, doors, and windows. There is the 25C tax credit is you can claim every year. The max that you can claim is $3,200. That's $2,000 for heat pumps or heat pump water heaters, and a max of $1,200 for electrical panel upgrades, insulation, doors, and windows. I will note that there are also like sub caps, like there's a cap for electrical panel upgrades, there's a cap for insulation, there's a cap for doors, and there's a cap for windows, which we can send you more information about that. The costs that you can claim on your tax credits include both the purchase cost and the installation cost. So any cost that you incur from the contractor installing, assuming that the total amount that you're claiming is under the cap for that particular upgrade, you're able to claim that. These credit limits reset every year, which I think is a really important point, because then you can start to plan out the types of retrofits that you're going to perform. So if you want to get ready to electrify this year, you could do electrical panel upgrades, and you can really go all in on that, and you can install a heat pump, since there are separate sort of caps there. But the next year you can do your heat pump water heater, you can do doors, windows, and you can keep going until until you complete your retrofit projects. And I think that's a really important point that I wanted to raise. The 25C tax credit on the left, there is a like 30% cap on the claim, which is, I think, a really important point too. On the contrary, the 25D tax credit, there is no cap. So you can claim up to 30%, but there's no limit. Like, if depending on what the cost is, you can claim 30% of that that cost on, when you're filing your taxes. That also includes purchase and installation cost. And there is a carry forward. So if you want to, if you don't want to claim it all at once, you can sort of carry forward those claims into future years. These tax credits are really important because, up until this point, there really hasn't been an attractive way of scaling up energy efficiency retrofits across the country. Even though, these resources have existed, the limits have increased, and there's more of a, I think these incentives are more attractive to the average homeowner to make these retrofits. Largely what has existed has been programs that have had to be re-upped and renewed, every year through utilities or through the Weatherization Assistance Program, LIHEAP. So now we have, a more sustainable way of incentivizing increases in efficiency and reductions of air pollution through electrification. There's so much in here. I'm going to circle back because I think it's an important point too. The electrification rebates are available to renters as well. So recognizing that there are some appliances that renters can, like portable heat pumps that renters can take advantage of. And we're working to make sure that those same sort of heat pumps are eligible for both of these, or the 25C tax credit at least. But Treasury has said that renters are eligible to take advantage of the 25C tax credit specifically. Next slide. Yeah, I'm trying to keep track of the chat. There is a lot of programs, and it's a lot to keep track of, but we're doing our best to follow and provide you with as much information as we can. The 45L tax credit is an incentive for increasing efficiency in multifamily housing, or in homes, increasing efficiency of homes. So homeowners, builders, developers, and investors are eligible to claim this tax credit. And this credit existed as well and was extended through the end of 2032. There are new credit amounts. So right now, these credits are tied to like a certain level of efficiency, measured by whether or not they meet the criteria for either the EPA's Energy Star program or the Department of Energy Zero Energy Ready Homes program. For multifamily per unit, you can get up to $500 in a credit for every dwelling unit that meets the EPA's standard Energy Star standard. For the DOE Energy Ready Home standard, you can get $1,000 off in the tax credit per unit. These incentives are enhanced when there are prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. So you actually can multiply the tax credit by 5, basically, in order to, if your project meets those requirements. For single family, the limits there, the 2,500 limit and the 5,000 limit, are available too. These are really important, and what the Inflation Reduction Act also did was allow developers or investors of the low-income housing tax credit to also use this 45L tax credit to stack them both without reducing the basis. That sort of concept, I think, is more familiar among folks who are working in the affordable housing space. But for others who maybe aren't familiar, basically what it means is you can, investors and developers will now be able to have a higher standard to which they're able to build or rehabilitate projects, and be able to get more resources for that. And the idea is we could get more units of housing at a higher level, at a higher standard. Next slide. One thing that I'll cover quickly, because I don't know as much about this one, but this is the 179D building tax deduction. And these are largely for commercial buildings, but multifamily buildings, certain multifamily buildings, I think above 3 levels are eligible to claim this deduction as well. The deduction amount increases again with a higher level of efficiency. The minimum increase in efficiency is 25%, which correlates to about a 50% deduction per square foot of the property. And the max is a 50% deduction reduction or increase in efficiency, correlating to a max deduction of $1 per square foot. There's also enhanced incentives for projects meeting labor standards. When talking about the increase in efficiency, the baseline is important, and the baseline here is the ASHRAE 90.1 energy standard, which I know isn't. I know there's some concern around that standard being too low, and we're working to make sure, see if there's any pathway to raise that standard. This deduction can be transferred, and this is new, can be transferred from state and local governments, tribes, and nonprofits who are doing these upgrades to the architect and designer of those improvements. So this is designed to increase contractor capacity and or interest in performing these upgrades, knowing that they can now also receive those tax deductions. Next slide. And I think there's a few more. So I know I'm talking for a bit. Am I good on time? Hopefully I'm good on time.
Yes, you're doing good on time, Jamal.
Okay, thank you. The next program is the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program. This program is being administered by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. These are for, this program is meant to incentivize energy efficiency, electrification, and resilience upgrades. And these are for owners of privately owned HUD subsidized properties, HUD subsidized affordable properties, including the Section 8, 202, and 811 programs. This is really important because this is the only program that HUD received in the Inflation Reduction Act. Largely, affordable housing did not get the attention or incentives that we would have hoped, and are going to be working to see what we can get through this Congress or help to prepare for the next big opportunity. But this is, it's $1 billion available through September of 2028. $837.5 million of that is for grants and direct loans, including an authorization to subsidize $4 billion in direct loans. So increasing the leverage that this program can receive, specifically for upgrades, efficiency, electrification, and resilience upgrades. And you can see some of those eligible uses down there below on the slide. So the largest part of the 1 billion is for those direct grants and loans, but there's also $120 million for HUD to administer the program, as well as a little over $40 million for energy and water benchmarking. I think one of the biggest problems that we see in affordable housing is that it has been really difficult to measure energy consumption in order to sort of track and understand where the improvements can come from. And so now HUD has resources to help benchmark both energy and water consumption, and hopefully help these properties start to map out retrofit plans to improve efficiency, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and improve resilience in the face of the increasing amount of natural disasters that we're seeing. So this is a really important program. There was a request for information on this program due, I think, last October. And so I think we're expecting to hear some information on this, sometime in the next few months. So I would, stay tuned on this too. Next slide. This is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is a really important program and is the largest non-tax program in the non-tax climate program in the bill. It's $27 billion through FY 2024, which is next year. It's a short timeline. It is an extremely impactful, potentially impactful program that includes $15 billion specifically for low-income and disadvantaged communities. The idea behind this program is that there's three pots. There's a $7 billion pot that is for the deployment of zero emissions technologies, particularly like rooftop and community solar programs. That $7 billion is available for state and local governments, as well as tribes and nonprofits. So the idea is that the state, local governments, tribes, and nonprofits can help deploy more community and more rooftop solar in their respective jurisdictions using the $7 billion. And that program is specifically for low-income households, or that part of this program. There's also a separate, so that's $7 billion off of the 27, so that leaves 20 billion left. That 20 billion is only available for nonprofits, nonprofit like financing entities. So think about community development financing institutions, green banks. That is like the type of nonprofit that we're looking at here. These are entities that have already been financing community development improvements, other green or climate or energy improvements. And that's really the intention behind that sort of nonprofit language here. That $20 billion that is available for nonprofits, of that, 8 billion of that is for disadvantaged communities. And the eligible uses of this of these funds is really broad and flexible. So any investment in a project that reduces greenhouse gases or reduces pollution is eligible. And there are a few tried and true ways of reducing pollution, electrification being one of the main ones. And so electrification is an eligible use, and also various energy efficiency or renewable energy sources are all eligible uses here. So 8 billion is specifically for disadvantaged communities, which leaves, so it's 8 billion we've covered. There's the 7 billion we've covered. So that's 15 billion that makes up the 15 billion there on the slide for low income and disadvantaged communities. There's also a separate $12 billion pot to help provide resources like administrative resources for these nonprofits that are going to be administering these programs. And that can also be used in disadvantaged communities as well. So we often say that the 15 billion is a floor, it is not a ceiling. We want as much of this program to go to disadvantaged communities as possible. The 12 billion, you can think about one use of that 12 billion is creating a new green bank, or creating a new entity that can help residents or communities in that jurisdiction access resources to improve and reduce emissions in that respective area. That 12 billion can also go towards existing green banks or existing community development financing institutions, really designed to provide like support and capacity in implementing this program. Because through the law, the Environmental Protection Agency has to start releasing funding by basically February 12th of 2023. We're not exactly sure what that is going to look like in turn, like programmatically, but that is one timeline to look for. There was a request for information on this due, like a public comment period that ended on December, like early December. And so right now, I suspect the EPA has collected all that feedback, has gone through it, and is prepared to release like a request for proposals. This is a competitive grant. So there will be, a lot of entities, states, localities, tribes, like applying for a certain portion of the funds in order to do what this program is intended to do. So that has to happen. The RFP has to come out, the request for proposals, the applications have to go in, and then there's an evaluation of those applications that also has to be taken into account, which is a lot of work that has to happen, before all of the funding is released and paid out by September 30th of 2024. So this, it's a really impactful program, and I know there are a lot of people, weighing in and offering support or wanting to offer support through public comment periods for the EPA. But one thing I think that you all can do now is start to think about how you might want to, or connecting with community development, financing institutions, or green banks, or with your state and local governments to establish a green bank to be prepared to receive some of these funds. And then start thinking about what the types of projects that you would want in your communities, and start I think there's work that we all can do to do some of that thought leadership in our communities, to think about where we might want to put a community solar farm, or where there's a community that could use a reduction in air pollution, or that could be electrified. Like there's all types of project that could happen through this program, and the sooner we think about it and start to build these partnerships to leverage these funding sources, I think the better off we'll be. Next slide. I think that I think this might be our last slide here, or one of the last slides, programmatic slides. So the EPA also received two really significant and flexible sources of funding in addition to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. There's this Climate Pollution Reduction Grant, which is $5 billion to assist states, air pollution agencies, tribes, and local governments in developing and implementing climate pollution reduction strategies. So I think $225 million of the $5 billion is for planning, and for planning grants. So in the text of the law, it says that these grants can go to at least one entity in each state, which means multiple entities in a state could, in theory, apply to put together a climate plan. And so, in recognizing the amount of resources that will be available through the Inflation Reduction Act and through the infrastructure law and the American Rescue Plan, I think it's important that we are mapping out and planning how each of those different funding sources can be leveraged with one another and with other resources as well, to deliver holistic pollution reduction projects in our communities and in our states. This grant program can help us to do that. It not only provides resources for planning, but it also provides, there's $75 billion available for implementation of some of those strategies that you put together in that plan. These are both, this is also a competitive, the planning, I think it's a competitive grant, and I'm going to actually check on that. So stay tuned. and we can follow up afterwards. But then the implementation grants, I suspect, will also be competitive as well. So that is a really important program that I wanted to highlight. And then the final program is the environmental and climate justice block grant, which is $2.8 billion in block grants for community-based nonprofits, other eligible partners, to address environmental justice issues, as well as climate justice issues. A portion of this funding was just, there was a request for proposals just released last week, maybe. And I think there's a notice of intent due in April for a portion of this program. This block grant program, based on what what's on the EPA's website, I think will end up turning into several different programs within EPA. So it won't just be the 2.8 billion dispersed all at once or through one pathway. It is going to be split into several different EPA programs. But the intent is really to address environmental and climate justice issues that are occurring in your communities. So think about air pollution monitoring, prevention and remediation, extreme heat, climate resiliency, reducing indoor air pollution. Like those are some examples that are mentioned in the bill, but I think projects beyond those are also eligible as well. So take a look at that that program on the EPA's website. And the deadline or the timeline for this is EPA must spend the money before September 30th. And I believe there's a typo here. I actually believe it's 2026 and not 2036. And the awarded grants can last up to 3 years. So that is just a taste of what is in the bill. There is also several programs specifically for tribal communities, in addition to the electrification rebates that I mentioned in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. There's a tribal electrification program. There's there's a Native Hawaiian climate adaptation and resilience program. So there are a few tribal programs that are also in the bill. And then the EPA has programs to reduce pollution, like at ports, with schools, with us doing like greenhouse gas reporting and accounting. So there's just a lot in here. And, again, it would have taken us forever to cover everything. But these are some of the major programs that I think is really important for us to keep an eye out for. So I think we have maybe a poll that's next, right, Stephanie? Yeah. So, I know I've been talking for a while, and I think we'll put the slides out, and this is being recorded. So no worries if you don't remember everything. But we're curious, what IRA funding opportunities do you believe may be most beneficial for your community? It would be helpful for us to hear some of that. Ooh, need some water. All right, yeah. And so what can you do now to prepare for these funds? Identify your priorities, budget needs, gaps in funding. I think one of the most important, thinking about the landscape of energy efficiency and electrification and like energy upgrade, like the landscape of that entire system. There is it has been gaps for a long time. Think about health and safety, pre-development, contractor training. The Inflation Reduction Act does provide some resources that can help as gap funding, or that can help address some of these other issues that have prevented, affordable housing from really maximizing the benefits, and as well as disadvantaged communities from getting the type of investment that's needed. So think about and map out what those priorities are, And I think there's a role that each of us can play to help us, our state energy offices, or our local governments, or our tribes, start thinking holistically about what we want, how we want to transform our communities for the better. So I think that there's work that we can do there. For the consumer-based incentives, Rewiring America, the organization I work for, put out a calculator. And the intent behind the calculator is to give consumers a sense for the types of resources that can be available to you and to us. We are still, there will still be, because guidelines haven't been released yet, there's still sort of, we'll have to wait in order to finalize some of those resources and information. But we really want people to start thinking about, how they can start improving, the quality and efficiency of their homes today, and start mapping out what that could look like. And so our calculator is designed to do that. There are also some other resources that City Renewables put together. We have, the slide deck is going to be really helpful in understanding the American Rescue Plan, infrastructure law, as well as IRA. You can engage with your finance departments. And, if you're interested in are wanting to know more about how to engage with the Inflation Reduction Act implementation process, feel free to reach out to me. We've been working closely with Emerald Cities Collaborative, ACEEE, and others to make sure that our voices are heard, because we care a lot about deploying these resources equitably, accessibly, and effectively. And so, we have a lot to say about that and have been, working together to put together comments on these various opportunities. If you're interested in learning more about how to engage in that way, definitely reach out, and happy to connect, or connect you to folks who I think might be helpful. But ACEEE, Emerald Cities, some of our other partners are really incredible resources too. There's just a lot of great partnerships happening, and it's really great to see people come together to make sure that these resources are deployed, like I said, equitably, accessibly, and effectively. So I think that is it on my end. Happy to be here, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Oh no, we have a Q&A, right? All right.
Yes, we have Q&A, and we have been furiously tracking all of the questions in the chat. Thank you so much for that massive amount of information about these unprecedented funding opportunities to advance all of our work. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please submit it in the chat. Please feel free to upvote questions you see that you find particularly important. And I'm going to go ahead with our first question. So this is a question from Ari Lopez Way, and I think it's a good foundational one that probably everyone needs to understand, which is, what is the difference between a rebate and a tax credit? And if you could also explain what's the difference between a refundable and non-refundable tax credit?
Yeah, so you can think about that. I think, many of you probably have friends or family that are, they get excited about, or, may get excited about filing their taxes because of the refund that they get. That is basically what refundability means. It means being eligible for a refund, whether or not you owe taxes. So refundability is, if you file your taxes and find out that you don't owe anything, you can still get a refund on top of that. Non-refundable means you only get the tax credit if you owe something. So, I'm thinking about the consumer tax credits for a heat pump, the max tax credit that I can get is $2,000. I would have to owe more than $2,000 in order to get that $2,000, that full $2,000 as a refund.
Well, is that across the board that tax credits in these bills are non-refundable?
Yeah, the vast majority of them are not refundable. And that's something that we really, really, really fought for refundability, recognizing that oftentimes low-income households do not owe enough in taxes to be able to claim these. And we knew that, and we really pushed on Congress to try to make these tax credits refundable, but they did not do that. So the vast majority are not refundable, which is really unfortunate.
And then could you explain briefly what a rebate is and whether that would be more beneficial potentially for low-income residents?
Yeah, a rebate is the term that's used in the law. Like I said, there are two rebate programs in the Inflation Reduction Act. There is the home electrification rebates for investments in electric upgrades. So electrical panel upgrades, rewiring, electric heat pump water heaters, induction stoves, all of that. That rebate program occurs at point of sale, and that is a really great distinction because point of sale, think about that as an upfront discount. I went to CVS this morning and I had some coupons, so I put my coupons in. It brought my total down, and I paid less for what I purchased. That is what point of sale means, and that is going to really increase access for low-income households, knowing that they can get up to $14,000 for qualifying energy upgrades. The second program, the rebate program, the whole home efficiency program, which sort of looks at the home in its entirety and thinking about how we are improving the efficiency of that home through weatherization, insulation, air sealing, window door replacement, electrification to improve efficiency of appliances. That program is not point of sale, which is going to reduce accessibility because you have to put up the money first and then either like model your savings or measure your savings, submit that to the state energy office or someone who will then give you your rebate, probably likely at some time after you've already paid. So that is not going to be as accessible for low-income households, but could still be meaningful when you're thinking about like the modeled pathway being a way to project the energy savings to potentially get some sort of upfront discount. That program is not barred from giving upfront discounts. It's just not required in the bill. So we're trying to work with DOE and provide comments to see how we can encourage them to make that program more accessible. Is that helpful, Annika?
Yeah, thanks for that, Jamal. And I did want to note, we also have some stealth experts who've been listening in from ACEEE. So we have Mark and Lowell who have been answering some questions in the chat, perhaps others, and we may be calling on them too for some of these questions that might get a little tricky. Stephanie, I think this next question is for you. It's from Joe Lang. What can we do to help our weatherization programs better implement the programs? And he notes that there are problems with contractor availability. There's a huge backlog to get work done. And then maybe others want to chime in too about what there is in any of these bills, what provisions might help with these workforce issues of not having contractors available as demand outpaces supply.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll just start off by saying that I think anyone who has engaged with the weatherization assistance program is aware of all of the challenges that exist. There are plenty of barriers to entry, considering that there are a lot of health and safety issues that need to be addressed before a qualifying household can even benefit from the WAP program, which has led to a lot of backlogs. And then there are other issues such as having limited availability for contractors, and also given all of the increases in prices. And so one thing that I find particularly amazing about the ARPA state and local fiscal recovery funds is that this funding is pretty broad, and like I said, the rules are very lenient, and therefore there are programs that can be created to address the barriers that are being or have been created to accessing the weatherization assistance program. And also there are workforce development opportunities, and there can be a way to stimulate the economy through these fundings because the funding is so open. And then when it comes to IIJA, there is more funding for WAP, but again, if you can't access the funding due to barriers, we have to address other issues. So I believe that the LIHEAP program would be a great way to also address these issues. Would anyone from ACEEE want to add to that?
Mark, Lowell, I don't know if there's anything about workforce that you wanted to highlight. Otherwise, we have plenty of questions to move on to.
Just to add that there are significant dollars in the IRA for workforce, and we can share some of those links in the chat as well. That RFI is also open right now.
Yeah, I think it's like 200 million that's available for workforce, and that is also for state energy offices to develop or begin to train folks in weatherization, efficiency, electrification. And like Mark said, the RFI is open right now. It closes a week from yesterday. And so if you have thoughts and want to share them, now really is a great time to do that. Send those to the Department of Energy.
So we had several questions about generally eligibility. So Linda Arbogast asked a question about various provisions being available for retrofits versus new construction. Christina Carvajal asked a question about availability of these various provisions for mobile homes. Berenice Garcia Teles asked a question about whether renters are included in these provisions. So I'm wondering if you could comment on those areas of new construction versus retrofit, mobile homes, and then house homeowners versus renters, and whether any of those groups are excluded from any of these programs, et cetera.
Yeah, so for new construction, the electrification rebates are allowed to be used in new construction, by as determined by Congress. I think that's going to be difficult to, administer, given the point of sale requirement as well, but point of sale income verification requirement. So I think we'll have to watch and see what Department of Energy says about that. In addition to the electrification rebate, which is a consumer rebate, the 45L tax credit, which is tied to the EPA Energy Star standard or the Department of Energy's Zero Energy Ready Homes program standard, is also available for new construction. Those are the and then some of the flexible funding, like in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, the Environmental Climate Justice Block Grants, the Climate Pollution Reduction Grants. Like, I think those can also be used, those can be used flexibly. And so I can imagine a project where maybe you want your community wants to develop more affordable housing, all electric new construction. Like, in theory, I think that could also qualify. We have to just make sure that we've stay tuned and learn more about what those rules are that the EPA puts out. In terms of the mobile homes, I suspect that I think that the clearest information I can give is the electrification rebates, which are appliance based. So they're not tied to the type of home, really. That is the only program that I think is clear that residents of mobile homes can take advantage of. There might be others. I'm not as well steeped in that. So that's something that we could check on. And then for renters, that has been a real advocacy point that we've been pushing on. And so we got Treasury who is administering the tax credits to include renters as eligible recipients of, the 25C tax credit, largely, which is for qualifying efficiency upgrades. We are in the process of trying to make sure that the electrification rebates can also be like that. A renter could also go and purchase equipment that is available to them and that they could sort of install themselves in their units or apartments. The vast majority of the Inflation Reduction Act does not specifically devote any resources for renters themselves. Although there are resources like the 45L tax credit, which can be utilized by low-income housing tax credit properties, which is, larger rental buildings, as well as the HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Green and Resilient Retrofit Program, which is for energy efficiency, electrification, and resilience upgrades in affordable housing. Both of those sort of programs are designed to improve the standard of rental properties. And so while those aren't direct incentives for renters, the intent is really to improve the quality and standard of the properties that renters live in.
And just a follow-up question that's come in the chat from Kai Palmer Dunning, wondering about which programs undocumented residents would be able to use.
Yeah, so I suspect that the consumer rebates could be utilized by undocumented immigrants, undocumented residents. I am honestly not sure about the rest. And so I would definitely take note of that question, as well as the one on mobile homes, and see what type of answers we could draw up together. I'm sure that there are partners on here that are partners that we work with that will be happy to work with me and to help figure that out.
Yeah, and a very similar question was asked about mobile homes yesterday during a session, and I did some research, and unfortunately I couldn't really find information on how different federal funds are available for mobile homes. And I think that this is why it's crucial to respond to the request for information that comes out for different programs, so that we're ensuring that different types of affordable housing and different types of populations are able to be eligible for these programs. So please make sure to stay in the loop and understand what the timelines are, so that when it's time to send public comments on these programs, you are ensuring that populations aren't being left out. And as Jamal said, we have a big effort, and we've been working on ensuring that this money reaches those that need it the most. But unfortunately, there are groups that get left behind, and we don't want to see that.
Next question is about pre-electrification measures. Robert Witzel and Dan McFarland asked about which funds would be allowed to be used for things like electric service, upgrades, breaker box, etc.
Excuse me. So the electrification rebates, that program does include rewiring upgrades, breaker boxes, electrical panel upgrades. So the electrification rebates is one. The 25C tax credit also includes some funding for electrical panel upgrades as well. The 25D tax credit for geothermal heat pumps, solar, and battery storage also includes, not explicitly, but because it has been an existing tax credit, it sort of has been standard practice that any electrical upgrades that are required in order to install solar or in order to install geothermal heat pumps can also be claimed as part of that cost. And you, as I mentioned earlier, the 25D tax credit, it's a 30% tax credit on the cost, but there's no cap. So it doesn't matter how much it costs, you can claim 30% of that on your as a, on your taxes. So if you include the electrical panel upgrades, the rewiring that's necessary to install those technologies, that's a pretty significant credit that you can get as a result. So those are
But not refundable, right, Jamal? You have to have a tax liability.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Our next question is about just a clarification question about the Green Resilient Retrofit Program. I think, Jamal, you referenced privately owned properties being eligible for this. And I think there was a question what privately owned meant. Who are those owners? What types of owners would be eligible for applying that funding?
Yeah, so in the universe of affordable housing, there are several types of affordable housing. There's public housing, that you think about those large high rises in major cities across the country. Those are publicly owned properties, so those would not qualify. There are there's the Section 8 program, which are vouchers effectively. So let's say that I qualify for housing rental assistance, and I qualify to receive a housing choice voucher, which gives me the opportunity to go out and find my own apartment in any part of the area that I want to live in, which could be a row home, it could be a single family home, it could be in a large multifamily building. But my voucher would bring down my costs, the cost that I pay, and then the government would pay the rest. I would pay 30%, the government would pay the rest. Typically, those vouchers are or residents that receive those vouchers seek out privately owned properties. So, if there is a person that owns multiple properties and rents them out, that is privately owned. Or think about, some of those larger type buildings, that is also privately owned. So those are those are privately owned. But they're not necessarily affordable. So the eligible properties here are affordable privately owned properties. So entities that have residents that use vouchers would qualify. And then there are also several programs at the Department of Housing and Urban Development for persons with disabilities, or where the persons there's a person's housing assistance for persons with AIDS, those types of programs are also, and properties that utilize those programs are also eligible to receive resources through that Green and Resilient Retrofit program.
So Jamal, it sounds to me like privately owned might refer to for-profit or nonprofit owners who are either accepting residents with Section 8 vouchers, or who have project-based Section 8 or other project-based programs they're participating in. Is that right?
Yeah, it is a yes. The project-based is the assistance is tied to the unit, so that unit is permanently affordable. But then the Section 8 is where the affordability is tied to the individual or the household. So wherever that household moves to, they're able to take their voucher with them. And yeah, so those properties have to be privately owned and or one of those situations. And there is a note in the chat where, what I'm describing is eliminating a lot of BIPOC families that are disadvantaged. And yes, that is true. There's a lot of Yeah, I mean, like the situation or the circumstances that we currently have in our housing, in the housing sector, like are not equitable, and quite frankly are just unjust in many ways. And there are a lot of people working to change that. So while we recognize that and are working to change it, that's what we've been given by Congress, and it's unfortunate, but we're, like I said, we're working to try to fix that.
And I will note that we're only talking here about the Green Resilient Retrofit Program, which is 1 billion out of all the funding we've been talking about today. So there are lots of other programs where folks don't need to be in, HUD subsidized housing or own HUD subsidized housing to take advantage of the programs. We are unfortunately out of time, and I have at least 20 more excellent questions to ask here. So I apologize that we can't get to more of those questions, but there was a great suggestion in the chat to create an FAQ just from the chat, and I think we're definitely going to be taking a close look at that so that we can get better at explaining what these programs do and in translating that for application in communities. So we are going to go ahead and take a break. Thank you, Jamal and Stephanie, and to everyone who's answered questions in the chat, including participants. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. I am thrilled to turn it over to Jamie Love of the People's Climate Innovation Center to start up our last session of the day and of the summit, Introduction to Community-Driven Planning. Jamie, please take it away.
Thank you, Annika, and hello, everyone. Welcome to our session. I hope you've been enjoying the summit and all has been going well. I hear there's been some really great discussions, so I'm excited to hear how folks are taking all of this in. My name is Jamie Love. I am the Director of Programs for the People's Climate Innovation Center. I use she, her pronouns, and I am based in Cincinnati, Ohio, on Shawnee and Hopewell lands. And so I want to invite my colleague, Esme, to introduce herself. She's running the tech for us today. And in a few moments, our other colleague, Corinne, will be joining. And she's co-presenting with me, but I will turn it over to Esme.
Hi all, my name is Esme. I use she, her, aya pronouns. I'm the Collaborative Partnerships Program Coordinator at PCIC. I'm based in Washington, D.C. on Piscataway land and really excited to be here with y'all today.
Thanks. And so I know there's a lot of folks in the room. We can't do intros with everyone, but we certainly want to welcome you and invite folks to drop your name and org and location in the chat and to share the native lands that you're on. If you're unsure of what those are, there's a link here that Esme just dropped in where you can put in your zip code and find out your native territory. So we love to see the variety and where folks are coming from. All right, I will go to the next slide. And just to share a little bit, I think you all may have heard this in some other sessions, but to know that we're here for the new R2E2 initiative, which is residential retrofits for energy equity. It's a nationwide initiative that will really be designed to provide training to state, local, and tribal governments, as well as community-based organizations and other partners that are working with energy upgrades for affordable housing, utilities, reducing GHGs, improving health, and creating good paying local jobs and helping to advance racial equity, which is a true focus here. And R2E2 is a partnership, sorry, go backward. It's a partnership of ACEEE, and our other core partners are Elevate, Emerald Cities, Collaborative, and HR&A advisors. And then People's Climate Innovation Center serves as an advisor to the project on centering racial equity and the outcomes related to the work and community-driven processes. So, all right, next slide. I love seeing where everyone is from in the chat. This is great. Lots of folks saying hi to Molly, who's here in Cincinnati with me. All right, so our session objectives today are that everyone will understand the community-driven climate resilience planning tool and principles and frameworks. You may hear us refer to this as the CDCRP. We'll say the name again throughout the presentation, but that is a framework developed by PCIC and other partners. So hopefully you'll have an understanding of the principles and framework in this tool. You'll understand the spectrum of community engagement to ownership and be able to identify the best ways to engage with community members. And then participants can identify ways to build stronger connections between various agencies, including local governments, community organizations, and residents. That is the ultimate goal. Next slide. So this is really about our focus on communities, and we believe that community-driven planning is critical. Communities have the right to define their own priorities and needs and not be defined by their local governments or other organizations that aren't necessarily representing their best interests or don't have an understanding of their needs. And it's really the approach and the practice that we use at Climate Innovation throughout all of our work. So that is the through line of community-driven processes. And our focus is really to break down those traditional top-down approaches where government is working in silos and really not considering the leadership and honoring the needs of community, but really flipping that so that community needs are centered and residents and leaders are part of the design and leading process along with their government partners. So it is not something that is top down, but it's really a bottom up approach that is being community driven. And I see Corinne has joined us, so I'll let you introduce yourself really quickly, Corinne.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Jamie. And y'all, there's over 400 of us on this call. Maybe we need to say happy birthday to Jamie in the chat. Give Jamie some birthday love. It is her birthday, Capricorn season. Hello. I hope you all have been enjoying the summit. And it's glad to be a part of it and share with you all today. I am Corinne Van Hook Turner. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the director of People's Climate Innovation Center, also known as Climate Innovation for short. And I am zooming in from Ohlone territory. And yeah, I think I'll pass it on back over to you, Jamie.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for all the birthday love, everybody. It's technically on the 25th, but I celebrate all month long. So, I have lots of things planned for the birthday. So I appreciate
Pre-birthday vibes. Pre-birthday
vibes. All right. So if you go to the next slide, Esme, we are going to share a little bit of background about climate resilience and walk through our framework for community-driven processes. But first, we really would like to hear from you all about what it looks like, what you think it looks like when the community leads. So what is the best of the best? What does it look like when things go really well and you get all of the things accomplished that you would like to see? We have a Mentimeter that Esme just put in the chat. If you go to the Menti and use that code, you can put in some responses and share with us what you feel really it looks like when community leads in the best kind of way. And I see some answers in the chat. We appreciate those too. I love that, heart-led and alignment. Again, it's menti.com, MENTI, and use the code 523-676-79. See some other responses. Gardens, information about what the community wants and asks, community informed, high sense of belonging, true listening and building together. Do you have, the code is not on a slide, sorry, it's just in the chat. But if folks are having problems accessing it, you can just feel free to drop it in the chat. Validation, I love that. Healthier and heartier families, which lead to more cohesive, functional communities. Equity, listening, inclusiveness, genuine connection. Great. Okay, our Menti didn't work. Womp womp, but that's okay. Community wealth, yes, I love that. And solidarity. So these are all right. These are all the things that we want communities to have. We want residents to feel, and we want leaders to understand and be respectful of, and know that if they're bringing these things into the process and are leading from a place of alignment and trying to achieve those things, then you can really get the best of what's needed for communities and by communities. So we'll go to the next slide. So power is participation in decision-making, and real participation changes the status quo. So, you know, we often hear about engagement, community engagement, and getting feedback and gathering information and all of those things, which are wonderful, but often don't get used or don't get incorporated in the way that was intended. And it still doesn't give the decision-making power to communities, which is what really shifts the momentum and changes the status quo. And so this quote by Sherry Arnstein, we use a lot, and Corinne is going to get into later, one of the tools that was inspired by Sherry Arnstein's ladder of participation, and really understanding what it takes to get to that decision-making and true participation in the process. Next slide. All right, so what is climate resilience? We're talking about community-driven planning for the sake of climate resilience and many other things. But first, let's think about climate resilience in the context of this work. So before I get into our definition, I'd love to hear in the chat what climate resilience means to you. And I see someone is asking about the materials shared. We definitely can share the materials. We have a couple of resources linked at the end of our presentation, but I believe that ACEEE plans to send out a list of resources and the recordings from the event. So some of these answers, this is great. Safety for all, thriving in spite of climate impacts, community-driven and defined solutions. Resilience equals bouncing forward to thriving communities. Healthy, affordable access, protection against intense weather or flooding, sovereignty with respect to critical resources. Love that. Being able to maintain and thrive within our environment without being more damaging than our baseline. That's really the goal, right? We want to be able to sustain and increase and not cause further harm. Have plentiful resources to withstand climate change. That is Corinne's motto, to be a thought of abundance. Being
Yes, harnessing it, manifesting it, channeling it in all ways possible. Even if we don't have it, we can do that.
All right, we will go to the next slide and share a little bit about our definition. So for us, resilience equals adaptation and mitigation plus social cohesion and equity. And this is a definition that was worked on with the Climate Innovation Team, the Kresge Foundation, and Movement Generation over the last few years to really get to this set definition of resiliency for us. And so in thinking about it, resiliency is really the opposite of vulnerability. It is being able to sustain and withstand and not be vulnerable to climate impacts and the things that are happening around us. So in general, vulnerability means that there's dependency on systems and structures that are already inequitable in that they dictate how and when and where and who has access to all of the essential resources and lifelines like water, food, shelter, energy, all of the things that climate change threatens. And then vulnerability and that dependency is maintained by having those typical community engagement approaches. They're really not trying to seek true resiliency. It's just maintaining the status quo. And so that's where the equity and social cohesion come in to being really central to climate resilience. And so when you think about this definition, it's bringing together all of the multiple bodies of work that inform community-driven efforts. So if you think about community gardens as an example, if you're looking at mitigation, it would be to help localize food systems and therefore reduce carbon emissions. When you look at adaptation, it's to become affordable, make healthy produce accessible, which is a form of adaptation, giving rising food costs. The social cohesion, it builds social cohesion, connection, networks within community members so that they connect with each other and increases their strength within their social circles and social capital. And then equity, if it is being community-led and community-owned, then the practice of holding equity at the center is really the fact that, this is a community-led process and community has the ultimate decision-making power over that particular project. So, our reality is that many communities are the most vulnerable to climate change, are those communities that have lost control or have the least control over essential resources and the least access to decision-making structures, but they also are feeling the most impacts. And so true resilience is about ultimately reducing dependency and vulnerability through community control and community governance. So in general, dependency equals vulnerability, and increasing resiliency means reducing that vulnerability. And that's what we want to strive for. And it really just aligns with those community-centered values and making sure that there is leadership and ownership and the decision-making power within those communities. Next slide. So when we think about why community-driven climate resilience planning, obviously there is a really urgent need to accelerate the pace of planning and implementation of climate solutions, but there's also a clear need to cultivate for more buy-in for climate resilience work in order to develop more effective solutions. We know that right now, more and more cities in the US are beginning to develop climate resilience plans. And a lot of times they bring in, the corporate consultants who are advising on the planning process. They aren't necessarily listening to the residents who are over living in the floodplains or who are, having air exposure and have increased asthma. They're not really taking into account what communities are saying are the problems and are the potential solutions. And so they might focus on reducing pollution or physical infrastructure. They're not taking into account the knowledge and experiences of the communities that have been made most vulnerable to climate disruption. And so they're really missing the mark on how to effectively reduce vulnerability to climate change. And we know that those who are most vulnerable are Black and Brown communities throughout this country, poor communities throughout this country. And so understanding that those are the folks who are closest to the problem and also are closest to the solutions. So what typically happens when you bring in these consultants is that they're missing the opportunity to really have holistic solutions. They aren't incorporating equity, and they really aren't looking at an equitable distribution of the infrastructure and plans that are happening. So they also aren't focused on the social cohesion and the social infrastructure aspect of it. So commitment to a particular place and shifting the decision-making processes helps to build that. So when you're really focused on a community that's experiencing the issue and then focus on shifting them to the power of the decision-making process, now you're building that social cohesion, you're infusing equity into the process, and you're really at the heart of community-driven solutions. So it's true, we need to reduce pollution and create new infrastructure, but also consider what are we focusing on pollution reduction and physical infrastructure for? Is it the communities of color that are most impacted by climate change, or is it something else? And we also need to create new social infrastructure through the planning and implementation process that really is shaped by the community. So that new social infrastructure helps to drive forward the resilience components of social cohesion and equity, but that only happens when those who are most impacted are those who are making the decisions and defining what needs to happen. We're going to get to how to reach them, David, just you wait. All right, next slide. So when we think about community-driven climate resilience planning, the goal of this is to build leadership outside of just the local government agencies, to increase collaboration and capacity, and to advance a multi-sectoral approach in order to have more holistic and effective solutions. So when the way that works is that when you're building community collaboration and ownership over the planning and implementation process, it helps to increase the capacity and increase the effectiveness of the solutions. So we know that the leadership capacity in local governments they don't have the capacity to do all of this on their own. City officials are and staff are, overworked. They've got many demands on them. They need those outside partners in order to really facilitate a process that will be beneficial. And so instead of hiring the consultants, why not invest into your local communities? And so if residents can be part of this, then they can make sure that they get the right infrastructure, resources, and processes in place. And that helps to increase the capacity of the local governments. And so investing those resources in the training that's needed, in resourcing for folks' time and expertise, and just understanding that they are bringing something to the table, and it doesn't always have to be the outside expert, because really the internal experts are the ones that can get you where you need to go. And then the community-driven planning just helps to foster collaboration across multiple organizations, multiple sectors. That also helps to increase the capacity. And then using a multi-sectoral approach for collaboration helps to give a deeper understanding. So, when groups are siloed, you often are only thinking about the piece of the pie that's yours and what your organization focuses on and what you do really well. But when you don't take into consideration those other pieces that are all connected and impacted by each other, that just helps to increase vulnerability, because you may be building up in one area but causing harm in another area. And so helping to have those understanding through cross collaboration really brings issues to the forefront. It helps you have a wider set of experts and creates the conditions to develop more effective solutions, because you're taking a holistic approach and you're hearing from multiple fronts on how things can work. And next slide, I will hand it over to Carolyn.
Thanks, Jamie. And yes, breaking out of our silos, Susan, is critical. And it can be tough. It can be tough, for government agencies and really all of the different sectors involved to do that, because we have so ingrained habits with the way that we have traditionally done planning. And we've traditionally done it in a very particular way for generations, right? Government institutions hold a responsibility when it comes to our policies, when it comes to our programs, when it really does come to meeting constituents. And at the same time, there's a reciprocal relationship there, right? That if the accountability held in the power of government institutions, as an example of one institution that holds power, we know that there are many. When we think about multi-sectoral, then we also need to understand that there needs to be a reciprocal relationship, not a transactional one, when we think about those in power and that have the privilege to actually make decisions, to work together and ensure that policies and programs reflect the priorities of the people that have to access them, live through them, benefit from them day to day, right? And that's the current work. Like, that's going to be the current work to really transition from, like, how do we fundamentally shift something that is top down to be more community driven, so that it can actually get to those communities that need it most, because if it can, then it really does benefit everyone. And the reason why we wanted to just take some time in the beginning to really break down some of these terms is because we never like to assume, I see friends in the chat and some of you I know, and so it's great to see y'all again, but we never want to assume when we come to a place what folks are familiar with and not familiar with. And so it's just really good practice, at least for us, to establish a baseline. What is the baseline of what we're actually talking about? And some of this is really inspired. A lot of what Jamie just talked about in breaking down these terms were years and years worth of work for us to actually come together and develop this framework. And it was because we were experiencing planning that actually was happening in communities, because there were big gaps in our access to planning that was happening traditionally, right? So, you know, back in 2013, 2014, there were a lot of climate and environmental justice, community-based organizations, grassroots organizations across the country who were actively trying to either challenge and form climate plans at local levels. And there were just various ways that they were successful at doing it. There wasn't one way. So, you know, we took those conversations over the course of the years in 2013, 2014 to really then assert, okay, you know what, traditional top-down planning has all of these gaps. If we are going to make a fundamental shift, we have to have an alternative, right? And so ultimately that alternative that we've come up with together that is really harnessed in this framework and in its practice is the community-driven climate resilience planning framework, right? So just wanting to give shout outs. There are co-creators and co-developers of this framework that were instrumental in pulling it together so that we could actually formally have this alternative to say that, like, this is the work that we need to do. It's going to be a long arc of work coming, right? So like that abundance piece that we named now, that we know it's possible to kind of do things better, right? And that is going to be a progression. And so, you know, we're further along now than we are even when we launched in 2017. So after, again, like those conversations to co-create this tool, this framework, which I would encourage you, and I know Esme's going to drop it in the chat. So for those of you that have seen it and are like, I'm familiar, you know, we call it CDCRP for short, but it does stand for Community-Driven Climate Resilience Planning Framework. You know, there are many tools from the co-creators and co-developers of it in there. So the framework in and of itself as an approach in theory and practice is one tool, but within that, you're going to notice spotlights, you're going to notice case studies, you're going to notice links to other tools from organizations that are actively doing this work in a community-led way. So if you're like, how do we do it? What does it look like? I want to relate to some stories. I encourage you, not now, but I encourage you at a later moment to dig into it and engage with it. And of course, again, reach out to us because, you know, we can't do this justice in this very limited workshop that we have. We can just do a small snippet today here with you all. And so when we launched this framework in 2017, we were also like, you know, we've got lots of resources and tools. Sometimes we can all agree they kind of just sit there after we launch it and collect dust, maybe, especially if they're pretty long. Like we might look at it, we might have some hype on it, you know, and talk about it and have workshops, but then we might lose sight of like, how are we continuing to hold this tool and utilize it over time. And so what we asserted is that we recognize that there are many different practitioners that are doing community-driven planning. And what's really needed to complement this framework is a national network. And so that's what NACRP, it's the National Association of Climate Resilience Planners. And that also launched complementary with this framework. And we have been continuing to increase the capacity of this network that is member-driven, grassroots-driven, right, with the alignment of asserting community-led planning and community, so it's communities leading, so that we can make sure we're having place-based facilitators. We can make sure that we have referral networks and not just alternatives to these consultants that come in and can really thoughtfully help support governments and other institutions to do better policymaking and planning in a more comprehensive and equitable way. And so just to kind of, you know, cover like, that's really at the heart of this framework, and it's actually at the heart of the work that we do in projects that we work on or programs that we lead in helping really increase and build our capacity toward this fundamental shift for a new way of planning. Next slide. And so as you dig into the framework, you're going to notice that central to a community-driven planning approach, one of the things that we really were able to synthesize through the development process is that they all hold one thing in common, right, which are the essential elements of planning. And so you're going to notice here some of the stuff on here on this slide is Spanish and some of it is in English. That's intentional. And so I will take a moment to really as I go through this slide, translate some of the Spanish pieces for those of you that don't read or speak Spanish. But I just wanted to really demonstrate the value of language justice in spaces like these. We have made, we tried to do our best, and part of engagement is making sure that we're creating accessible spaces. And in doing so, we have to be thinking about the language, not just the jargon, but the language in which we're able to communicate the information we want to be, the messages that we want to be heard and understood. And we have to make sure that we're creating access to do that. So this is very intentional that I put Spanish here, because oftentimes we still dominantly deliver information heavily in English. And we need to continue to progressively do better about holding a balance of those spaces. So again, I want to just take a moment to name that, but getting back to the essential elements and how they're all connected is that we call these the essential elements of community-driven planning, because this was thematically at the heart of community plans, that many of community-driven plans start with a vision, right? They start with a community vision of really just asking, like, what do we want? What do we need? Right? What do our communities basically want and need, even if we don't have it right now? And what is it going to take to get there? And if we're successful, what does it look like? So really that dreaming and liberatory space is really, really important, right? Because oftentimes if we think about traditional planning, we start with constraints first. And that could be really hard to plan, because if you're starting with constraints, then you really aren't able to explore what's possible, and you're not able to plan to break down those barriers in order to then explore what's possible. So we start with, again, abundance, right, in that visioning, right? And then we think about, okay, how are we from that strong vision that is aligned, right? We want to make sure that we're in alignment. Sometimes we don't always agree. And that's going to be important, and that's going to be true in many different communities, but because we're all doing different pieces of the work. But one of the key things is we want to make sure that we're having an aligned vision, because if we're in alignment and we understand collectively what that is, then we in our various roles can make sure that we're all driving toward the same thing, and making progress in a deeper, more long-term sustainable way. And then we want to think about the other piece of the essential elements, which is really about community power, right? So here, this is where I'll translate. It's really what you're seeing there in Spanish is the ability to have influence and decision-making authority, whether it's granted or not, in traditional positions, and not in order to bring about change, right? And we want to recognize that this community power can both happen externally on an organizing level, but it can also happen within institutions. And if that is truly the balance happening, well, that's what we actually call an inside-outside strategy. So that with that vision alignment, we can ensure that the organizing that's happening in communities on the ground is actually connected and reflected into the organizing that actually needs to happen within institutions or within government, so that they can be complementary and that we can see collective wins, right? So it's not just the campaigns, it's actually internal as well. And then from there, what we want to ensure is that there are community-led solutions that are flowing from that vision and really asserting what's possible. And so the translation there is that community solutions are important, because they are representing those that are closest to the problems happening, within the environment, or things that are exacerbated by the climate crisis, right? So we have to be thinking about community-led solutions, because those that are closest to the problems are closest to the solutions, right? And so it's almost kind of like, for those of us that are familiar with permaculture, right? Nature-based systems, right? Well, there's one principle, like the problem is the solution. And so it's really acknowledging and honoring that relationship. And so again, just wanting to wrap up and close with this piece around, this is the engine and the essential elements. You'll see in the framework that these core elements of community-driven planning actually do translate to a larger web where there are about like 7 other pieces. But at the end of the day, the baseline has to be these main 3 that you want really solid and that you want to start with, and that are embedded in many of the community-driven plans that are happening locally that even end up getting adopted, right? We have some examples of community plans, and I'm sure some of you in the chat can probably think of examples where you are that actually end up informing some climate action plans or get adopted into climate action plans, right? And so at the heart of it is to really have these essential elements. Next slide. All right, so along with these essential elements, it was important for us within the framework of this just new way of, okay, community-driven planning, we have these concepts, but actually, like, what is it? How are we actually leading with values and principles? Because at the end of the day, we're working with people. Yes, we have the ecological impacts of climate, but we really need to be in relationship with all of those things in a complementary, comprehensive way. And so it was really, really important to distill these concepts into 5 principles. And those 5 principles being, whole systems thinking, desired outcomes reflected in every step, planning process is learning process. That's one of my favorite ones. Planning into action. And even most importantly, given how structures continue to exist that we're trying to do deeper work on, is balancing power dynamics among stakeholders, which is twofold. So I'm just going to go back and I'm going to take a moment again to break down each of these terms. Because we want to make sure that we are kind of bringing life into these and meaning into some of these concepts that we're sharing with you that some of you may be more and less familiar with. So when we think about whole systems thinking, what we really are talking about here is that we want to recognize that climate change impacts many aspects of society, right? So that's, again, as Jamie mentioned, our energy, our water, our food systems, right? Where we live, the ability to be able to afford where we live, the ability to have it be energy efficient, if we're talking about just the relevance of this summit. And so in order to do that, and recognize that requires a holistic understanding of the complex challenges and also the complex and holistic solutions. So this is really kind of what Jamie was talking about when she said, oftentimes we have a habit of being siloed, and we may not do that intentionally, but when we do that, then we're just focusing on a specific piece of the pie, when really we understand that these issues and the issues and both the solutions to them have to be interconnected. So that's why we assert that a grounding principle that is essential is whole systems thinking. And then when we think about desired outcomes reflected in every step, this really does speak to the outcomes and principles such as equity, such as community-derived planning. They should be embedded in each step of the planning and implementation process, right? That we can actually have very tangible activities, very tangible things that are happening along the way that allow us to chart how we're doing and kind of gives us some information about our impact. And then that leads to, again, like I said, one of my favorite planning processes, learning process. The reason why we want to look at some of these outcomes reflected in every step is because planning processes, learning process seeks to foster multi-dimensional learning across governance levels. So what that means is that learning goes across and between stakeholders and sectors. This enables us to have the ability to actually increase understanding of causes and consequences of climate disruption and processes and pathways to address it. And so what we want to always ensure is oftentimes if we think about traditional planning processes, we might do some surveying in the beginning and then we chart along and we forward on with the plan. But because we haven't done along the way assessment and evaluation and learning, which is actually a part of engagement, a lot of times the end result, we do it after, and then we've lost a lot of time and really ultimately a lot of resources because we didn't have the opportunity to go back and make some key shifts and adjustments so that our end result could actually be much stronger and much more effective, right? And then that brings us into planning into action, right? Oh, sorry, before I go to planning into action, another just tangible example of that is timelines. We love timelines, and they are a guide they're a good marker, but we're people, right? And life happens, and we are still navigating the realities and coming out of a pandemic as the COVID variants flow, and we're still trying to adjust to the virtual world. So, you know, sometimes timelines in and of itself can be barriers to engagement. They can be barriers to being successful because sometimes we don't, oftentimes we don't plan enough for the planning and the implementation of something. And so by the time we've done all the planning, the whole timeline is done, the funding is over, and then you have to start all over again, right? So just another example of kind of how some of these things can show up, and our ability to be flexible and to make these key shifts will be better in the long run ultimately. And some of that is very much embedded in our stringent timelines that sometimes we need to be able to let go of. And then planning into action. So we want to make sure everything is in place for implementation. And what this means is resources, right? Not just financial, though financials are a big one, right? Financial resources are a big one because we have to understand that communities, it's not their day-to-day job to work in planning in the same way that government institutions and employees and staff might get salaries and benefits to do. However, that doesn't assert that that planning isn't happening in other ways. And so we need to make sure that we're mitigating the impact with various resources, financial being one of them, but also capacity building resources, technical assistance, leadership readiness, etc. And then that last one, which is also really, really important as we think about how do we actually do and sustain collaboration once this engagement happens, is the principle around balancing power dynamics among stakeholder, which is twofold, because we have to be able to recognize and exist that power exists, right? So we just looked at that quote from Sherry Arnstein about participation is power, right? So power exists in our roles, power exists in our institutions, and we cannot be naive to think that it doesn't. And so we want to be transparent and recognize the realities, because the better we're able to do that, then we'll be more successful about the realities of what we're able to do, and also how we're able to assert and leverage that power for what we need it for. And so one, in terms of the twofold thing, there's procedural, right? Piece of this balancing power dynamics, right, which is increasing awareness of systems of oppression and exclusionary practices, cultures that can perpetuate power imbalances, often that contribute to climate vulnerability. And then you've got the decision makers sharing power in the planning and implementation process, and groups actually increasing their capacity to step into that power, right? So that's that participation as power piece. And then we think about the other piece of it, which is substantive, our ability to increase access and also control over the essential resources that Jamie was just talking about a moment ago, but doing so at the community level, because what we want to do is reduce that vulnerability and power dynamics. We know that it exists, and in recognizing it, we have to be working toward the shift, because then participation can't be power if we're not empowering those that need it most to step into it. And that starts with being able to build that capacity and really balance that along the way. Next slide. So in that breakdown, I want to invite you all. I've done my spiel for a bit, and I want to kind of hear from y'all. Feel free to continue sharing in the chat. Keep it going. I love it. I want to hear from you in terms of what's challenging about community-led planning processes. And then also, what principles do you most connect with and why? And how do they show up in your community and in your work? Oh, I'm receiving the love. Thank you. So are y'all. And this is why I'm putting it to y'all, because we are over 300, almost 400 into this virtual community of resource and experts. Yes, there are resources and guides for sure. All right, Ashley, I found in my participation in planning processes that facilitators will take a long time to be inclusive of goals and objectives of many in community, but they spend very little time on implementation because they are afraid of the contentious nature of prioritizing actions. They need to be more comfortable with setting priorities together, even if it's a tough conversation. Absolutely. Absolutely. Because then, I mean, and I think, again, part of that is just a recognition of being able to navigate tensions and conflict. That's going to happen. Yeah. Part of the challenge is that community leaders are often not paid for our work, so we find it challenging to participate fully in the process. Yes, that's the access piece that we need to think about for sure. And we're going to get into that when we look at the tool. All right. And we've got a reply here. Oh, here we go. Yeah, one key challenge is the community contributions are used to create impressive systems that get grants for everyone except the soldiers. Thank you. Yes, tedious meetings. We got to make these processes fun and engaging, right? I mean, if we think about, okay, let's just take kind of a page from a book of like corporate mergers, all these fancy dinners, going to a bar, breaking bread like on a company card. Can we think about actually how do we relationally come together, have conversations and build? It's oftentimes not in like these closed door meetings on the clock from a 9 to 5 where other people kind of have jobs that they need for their like livelihood, but they're still committed to a quality of life. So how are we actually creating senses of community and actually going to where the leaders are cultivating this all the time, right? Instead of actually saying, hey, come do our thing. We're having this engagement event. Come speak at the city council meeting, come help us with how are we just thinking about other ways in which we can be meeting community where they're at instead of asking them to meet us where we're at, especially if we're low on resources to invite them in. Yeah. All right. Yes.
There was a question on are there good community-driven planning consultants?
Yes. And the national, so this is why we are continuing to build out the National Association of Climate Resilience Planners. And yes, we are actually at the end of the month having a certification for our cohort of community-driven facilitators. But we have lots of partners and members that are a part and in our network that help us do this work in different ways across the country. All right, so these are great, keep them coming. And again, for the interest of time, I have to move on to the next slide. Some of what, like Jamie said, it's coming. Okay, how do we actually do this engagement? Okay, we're acknowledging what exists, we're getting there. So again, similarly to the framework, some of y'all might have heard of the community engagement to ownership spectrum tool. And so it is a complementary tool that actually came out of the co-development of the community-driven climate resilience planning framework, where we were asserting a new way of planning. And critical to a new way of planning is that we have to be able to actually do better engagement as a part of these fundamental shifts. And so you'll also, some of you may be more familiar with, you might have heard it. This was launched shortly after and worked on in 2017 when we launched the framework and when we launched the NACRP, the National Association of Climate Resilience Planners. The creator of the tool is Rosa Gonzalez from Facilitating Power, also a partner member of our National Association of Climate Resilience Planners. And at the time when this was created, we were a program held within the Movement Strategy Center. And so now we are incubated and grown into our own organization. And so it was really essential for us to take some, influence from some similar tools, like Sherry Arnstein, who said participation in power, this tool specifically is inspired by the Arnstein ladder of participation. Okay, so you're going to see that. But what is distinct about this tool is that it takes, two very distinct things to know about this tool. And Esme is going to drop the whole tool in the chat just so that you have that link, and of course links will be shared. And again, don't dig into it now because it's a more extensive tool. But one thing to note is that this tool is both an assessment tool, which I think most people know it for, like but it's also a developmental design tool. So that's just always something that I like to kind of make clear about this tool is that one, yes, it's important to assess where we are, but we have to be able to understand how we then assess where we are to then create a plan and design a plan with community that entails a developmental process to improve our engagement and really work through and toward community ownership of systems. Because that's ultimately, if we know we've been successful and communities can thrive without being vulnerable, right, by dependency on systems, then we've been successful. So one thing to note is that this tool really does chart a pathway, and it is a developmental process. So it goes all the way from inform, and actually you're going to see in a moment, it actually goes a step before that, 0, which is ignore, all the way to defer to, right? And so inform being the ability to provide the community with relevant information. This might look like, just all the different ways we can think about how just we might see or not information that goes out. So think about an Amber Alert, right? Like those things are like critical pieces of information that we need to know. And then there's the consult phase, which is like gathering input from the community. So this might look like how many of us like kind of get these random text messages that ask us what we think and if we can like rate how this program is doing or give input, or maybe it's a campaign type text and we're like collecting this information and we might respond to it or not. And then there's involve, right, where we're wanting to ensure community needs and assets after we've actually collected the information are actually integrated into the planning to inform actually what gets solidified or then moved on to the next level of implementation. And this is the important phase, right? Because different from consult, what we're saying is that when we get consulted, information is collected, but we really have no way of knowing what's happening with that information. But when we involve, we have the ability to then think about how the value of contributions of what we've asked folks for then gets implemented. And then we move to collaborate for, which is like, we want to then, after we've done that, after we've had that involvement, ensure community capacity to play a leadership role in implementing decisions, right? So it's not just like, oh, okay, I understand how my contributions have influenced the plan, but what is my role in that? If I'm doing that work, like, how do I get recognized to play a leadership role? How do I even get the recognition and resources to benefit extensions of being able to like service my community? And then defer to, right? Ultimately, if we are developmentally creating and increasing our capacity of engagement, which should be reciprocal, ongoing, sustainable, that we're also wanting to increase the way in which different resources and expertise and collaboration are allocated. And so what this says is that if we're successful, we want to be able to foster democratic participation and equity by bridging the divide between community and governance through community-driven decision-making. And so one example of this that folks might be familiar with is like participatory budgeting. And is participatory budgeting like perfect? No, like I used to live in Vallejo, very small percentage of the budget, but it really is just charting a pathway toward taking something that is oftentimes held within institutional government power and then creating a way in which we can be fostering some sort of infrastructure for communities to have that power to govern for themselves. Next slide. So commitment to language, yes, Vallejo, shout out to Vallejo. I know I had to move from there, sadly, but I love living in Vallejo. So I just wanted to share that the previous slide that I just went over for my Spanish readers and my Spanish speakers, that this is the Spanish version of the slide. And so just wanting to name that here. And in a moment, when we get into an activity that I'll invite you all to do, that will be shared with you so that you will have direct access and reference to that. But everything on this slide is just the Spanish version of what I've just gone over. Next slide. And so remember how I said that like we were just talking about one, inform all the way to defer to, but that a step beyond that is 0, ignore. So again, this what we want to understand here about this tool and why we need to think about how we're doing engagement is because these are reflections of the real ways in which communities experience how engagement happens when it's held in institutional power. And all the way to the extreme left is marginalization, where there is really no access at all, right? There's no decision-making power, there's no participation power, there's no even, it's kind of what Susan said, that like, either some folks don't want to be a part of it, or they do, and maybe they don't know because they didn't know that meetings happened. They didn't know they could play a role, right? So we really do want to recognize that on the far end of the spectrum, it still does exist, and this is because of power, that folks just don't have, communities just don't have access to be able to try and participate. But that in charting a pathway as we go to inform, which is, again, we've shifted that a bit to be both preparation or placation, consult, which is like that limited voice and tokenization, voice, which is like, oh, okay, we see how our voice is being embedded in plans. Delegated power, we're starting to practice what it ultimately then looks like to then start actually building structures of community ownership. And the reason why I say that this is a developmental process is because that each stage of the spectrum, they all hold keys to this process, or to move up the spectrum, or to progress along it. But another important point to make is that they also hold blocks and barriers to get stuck. And the reason is because just as this is a tool to both assess and design, if we are not accurately assessing where we are, meaning that even if we may want to be involved, if we're not really there and we're not doing an accurate assessment of the activities that we're doing to engage folks, it might be that, oh, we invited them to the meeting, we made it in multiple languages, but they just didn't care because they didn't show up. Well, did we do an accurate assessment of like maybe why they didn't show up? What time was it at? Did they get the, how do we know? Did we get the information? And that's kind of an example of kind of being a trap or getting stuck in the developmental process, is not having an accurate assessment of the impact and the success of the activities along each stage. And also why planning processes, learning process, the principle is important, because we need to then be able to make key shifts in order to do that. And at the bottom, you're going to notice that resource allocation and ratios are a part of the key shifts. So you'll notice as that we progress along the developmental process of the spectrum, that systems administration investment, meaning that like money and time and capacity and roles and power and decision making is heavily held 100%. And you'll notice that as we progress along the spectrum to defer to, that number is shifting quite significantly, right? So that we don't have heavily systems admin investment of resources. We actually are moving those resources, both financial and also both in terms of roles and decision-making, to community. So one example of that is like, okay, well, maybe we don't need a consultant. Maybe we actually need to get the experts that are rooted in community to be our community partner, because they probably have already done assessments of what the priorities are. And so why don't we actually move resources to them instead of hiring a consultant who isn't from a place, who may have a fancy, like high expensive rate and look all nice and glossy, but that can actually go into a community and cause a lot of harm, because they're not recognizing and honoring the work that's already happening there, right? And so these are just examples of like how we can both have a pathway of like holding a key to progress along the developmental spectrum, but also how we can get caught in the traps, because it's really easy, right? It's easy to work with who we know, it's comfortable. We were kind of worried about upsetting someone. We don't want to do this thing, and I hate this term of like engagement fatigue, or we're like, they're tired of hearing from us, they don't have capacity, we don't have money for them. But really to get out of those assumptions and actually think about, one, there's many communities working, not just a handful of usual suspects. So like our ability to get out of the comfort zone and really build these relationships so that we're broadening and widening our ecosystem of community partners that we can be working with so that we can continue that developmental process. So just wanted to take a moment to just really do kind of an overview of the tool, its purpose, and kind of some of the key things to know about applying the tool. So now I want to invite you all to engage with the tool a bit, right? I'm sure that as you all are looking at this tool and you're like, oh, we do some of that. Oh, yep, I'm over here. This is where I am on the spectrum. Here's some of the goals. I want to offer, we're going to take about, oh, we're doing good on time. So we're going to take about 10 minutes, may even stretch that to 15. I'll do a check-in in a moment. We've got some handouts that Esme is going to go ahead and put in the chat. Thank you, Esme. These are a set of guiding questions. And Esme, if you want to screen share, I can talk through the activity. And in the handouts, we're going to screen share back once we give you some time to work on these so that we can then hear from you some of your reflections. And while Esme is working to share screen, once I go over this handout with you, you will have about 10 minutes to work on it. And for ease and reference, you'll see that there is a link to the particular slide, the actual tool slide that I was just showing you and talking through, just in case as you're going through these prompts, you want a quick reference. So I want to go through that a bit just to make sure you all are clear before you all have time to work on it on your own. Normally, we like to break out, but we just can't break out realistically over almost 400 of you. Or in person, we'll do this work together. So we're just going to have some individual time. Then we're going to have, I'm going to ask a few folks if they can actually share each of the pieces. So what we want to do here is we want to just take a moment based on the spectrum tool that I showed you to map, reflect, assess, and set goals. At the bottom of this document for my Spanish speakers and readers, it is in a Spanish version as well. So just scroll down and you're going to see your version. Linked in there as well will be the reference slide that you can reference for the tool that I just went over in Spanish. Just scroll back up a little bit. What you want to do here at the first part in the mapping exercise is you want to name at least one activity and or example along each stage using the prompts below, right? So, and each of the prompts they translate to each stage of the spectrum tool, right? So 0 all the way to 5. And these are just some guiding questions to really think about your own work, your own place. And you'll even notice that 4 and 5 are really, really specific to even why you wanted to come to this summit, right? So even take a moment to think deeply about, well, what do these things mean in terms of holistic retrofits and affordable housing, right? That are going to improve energy savings and health benefits and local jobs, et cetera, right? So we're going to take some time first to go through and do at least one example or activity for each stage there. And then you're going to take some time to reflect. And scroll up a bit, Esme. And you want to think about, okay, after I've done that, what are you seeing? What are the strengths you're seeing there? And also, what are the gaps you're seeing about some of those examples and activities that you've identified for each of the stages along the spectrum? And then after that, take a moment and think about, okay, now that you've done this, where would you assess that your work is or what you've mapped is along the spectrum? Like, where does it currently fall? And then finally, set a goal, right? You want to kind of set a goal where you are along the spectrum about where you actually want your work to be. And maybe even think about when that might be possible. You all will have about 10 minutes-ish or so. Esme is going to play some music while you all are working on this. There are various ways depending on where you are. If you're on your phone, maybe you want to use notes. This is not an editable document. It is a reference document. So if you need to pull up another Google Doc or you need to pull up a Word doc just to kind of record your reflections, because we are going to come back and share. And I'm going to ask for 4 volunteers And if they can put their stack into the chat when we come back, just to kind of come off mute and like share each phase of where they landed so that we can kind of wrap up. Never enough time. And so normally these workshops are like half a day. We've even done full days. We've done series of full days when it really gets into the assessment and design piece. So if you didn't get through it all, that's okay. You will all have access to these these resources will be shared with you. And then maybe you can do that later. And again, reach out to us, and hopefully as a part of this R2E2 initiative, we will be able to provide support as needed, as Jamie mentioned when we opened the call. So in the chat here, you'll notice, oh, perfect. Thank you, David. All right, I've got a volunteer. Okay, so we're gonna get into it. I'm gonna adjust because of time. I wanna be able to address some of the questions that we've been tracking before we wrap soon. But David, I think this is a great example to go ahead and get into. So an example you gave for 0 stage, marginalization and ignore, meetings that occur during working hours. Yes. 1, for informed posting on websites, established social media, listserv accounts, holding community information meetings. 2, above, with an emphasis on discussion rather than education. 3, ensuring that they have a seat at the stakeholder table and that stakeholder meetings take place online and during non-working hours. Yes, and I would also just add to that, making sure that we have checked for all accessibility needs. That would be useful for the participation, for them to hold that seat, and any alternatives in case they cannot make it, like what are the backups? Do they have someone to come instead? 4 is TBD, but see discussion earlier this afternoon. So 1 might be like, one example here in the Bay is, PG&E is our investor-owned utility. And so we have PG&E, and there was a lot of work to get community-based energy, the East Bay Clean Power Alliance. And what they have tried to establish is an advisory where there can be, public utility representation, like the Public Utilities Commission, and also making sure that there are some community seats, right, to inform some decision making. It's not perfect, but again, making sure that it's more than just a seat and a voice, but that there's some level of authority and decision making behind an advisory. And then 5, make use of all the Inflation Reduction Act funds. Yes, I love this specific example. We covered earlier this afternoon, as well as similar state local funds. B, strive towards binding agreements with these community organizations. For example, BERTO. Love BERTO and BERTO 2.0, and they're doing some amazing work to actually expand in other areas of Massachusetts. So shout out to ACE for holding that down, and all of their partners. And actually, they are being supported by a practitioner in our network with that work. C, have residents of various housing units and/or communities take on authority and responsibility for making that happen. So thank you so much for modeling, David, just an example of this. For time, I wish I could ask for others, but please do continue to share in the chat. Actually would love to hear about in the chat if folks noticed any gaps, any strengths, maybe even put your number on where you and your work thought you landed, and even maybe some goals. So whichever one that went based on where you landed in the document, a goal, a strength or a gap, or where you are after you did this initial mapping on the spectrum. Where is your work 0 to 5? So while you all are doing that, I'm going to, yes, can you send? Not sure. I think that's a good time to transition though to questions to wrap up. I'm not sure what you mean in terms of send something. Maybe the reflections is potentially what you mean, which I think is yes. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Corinne and Jamie. My notes say to thank you for your excellent presentation, but I really feel like it was more of a discussion, and I love that you gave folks time to reflect and grapple with what are honestly hard questions and require self-reflection and honesty with ourselves. So thanks so much for sharing that. I want to turn to a few questions that were in the chat. There weren't a ton. One of them was from Lauren Bell, who asked Jamie about her thoughts on consultants working with local nonprofits and CBOs. Can they work together? What does that look like?
So I think, yes, they can work together if the consultant is centering the community and has the community needs in mind. And so just thinking about, you know, who are those folks and who are you selecting? There are many consultants who, you know, have this way of practice and this approach of really working alongside with community and building in their leadership throughout. And then there are others who come in as the expert and they want to tell you what to do and how to approach it. So I think community-based organizations can just look at, you know, who are the different consultants that are there. Perhaps there's actually a consultant in the community that they can hire to work with them. There are lots of folks who play multiple roles and can do that work with them. But if they are, you know, bringing in someone who's not from the community necessarily or not as familiar with a particular neighborhood or something, just making sure that, you know, they really vet that person and make sure that there's alignment and a like-minded spirit for how they want to approach the process together.
Yeah. Thanks, Jamie. And I would add, yes, I think that checking in is important because they might actually have someone that is, I think, in terms of a collaboration, trust is a really big thing. And even then you can't guarantee it. You can't guarantee trust. You can't guarantee safe space. And so oftentimes, you know, I think it's just for the community and the partner to decide, you know, what's going to be the best consultant also that has the capacity and the expertise to balance power dynamics. Not all consultants do. In a way that is justice oriented, right? And that, like, if harm happens during the collaboration, if conflict happens, like, they have the ability to navigate it so that that partnership and collaboration can be sustained over time. So I think that's also a critical piece of knowing what the consultant's expertise is.
Thanks for those answers. Next question is from Yantrisha Coleman. Any resources or guides on how to best balance power dynamics? What tools are out there?
Take a deeper look into the framework. They are actually highlights. So every principle is broken down with a case study example. So that'll be my quick answer for time. And if there are specific examples, maybe that's a next step we can figure out, Annika, and I can provide very case-specific example references.
Thanks, Corinne. Next question from Adrian Howell, I apologize. Can we talk or learn about the technological advances that permit real community economic ownership? Shared solar, for instance, financial mechanisms that permit community shareholders. Any comments or insights to share there?
Yes, I think those are always complicated because we're still working toward how to bridge what is technical capacity and access to communities that just can't afford it. They honestly don't have access to some of these things, or there are organizations that are actually working to create programs around that. And I think we can talk about it, but I think that there's still a lot of capacity building and engagement that needs to be happen around the terms itself. Because there are various approaches, and honestly, especially in the state of California here, they don't always align and they don't always agree with some of the technological approaches because of the risk and opportunities that they present to how they might impact community or affordability or access. Energy democracy, yes, absolutely. Denise Fairchild.
We've had just like a couple more questions roll in, but we do need to get to our closing. So I can make sure that Jamie and Corinne get these questions. And if there's something they have to share, we'll figure out a way to get that information to folks. Great. Well, thank you again to Jamie and Corinne. And it is time for our closing. So I'm going to start sharing some slides. Just a moment. Okay, great. So next up, I would like to bring on Jonathan Meyers of R2E2 Partner HR&A Advisors to offer some closing remarks and reflections on what we heard over these past 2 days of the R2E2 Summit. Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Annika. And thank you to Corinne and Jamie for that really excellent session that sort of summarizes a lot of what we've been thinking about. And thanks to all the speakers and moderators and participants over the last couple of days. It is obviously really daunting to try to summarize the last couple of days. I personally keep reflecting on something that somebody said in one of the sessions yesterday, which is that they felt like they were out there in the field doing the work all by themselves, and then suddenly they found themselves here with an opportunity to hear from, learn from, and speak to lots of other people doing that same work. And specifically over the last couple of days, we've had attendance from hundreds of individuals and organizations, about 24% government, 48% community and nonprofit organizations, and 27% companies and industry partners. And that diversity of perspective, to me, feels just about exactly right for the moment that we're in. It's a great affirmation that this is a really active, diverse, and national conversation that we are all now a part of. We know that any pathway to addressing our climate emergency needs to include an intensive effort to decarbonize existing buildings. We also know that we can't effectively address residential property upgrades without understanding the necessary relationships between energy efficiency and improved housing quality. And we know that a successful effort needs to be rooted in equity with strategies to address lasting damage from environmental racism and injustice, address renter costs, community displacement, and be relevant for urban, suburban, and rural communities and for the remarkable diversity of housing types found in communities around the country. We've seen and heard from practitioners at the building level, people who are finding ways to put the energy, housing, and community pieces together and who shine a light on pathways to greater scale. But we also know that we haven't found all of the right answers to these questions yet, these challenges, and that the right answers are going to emerge through countless local partners and partnerships, community-centered and comprehensive approaches, and from the collective efforts from people like those gathered here. Finally, and perhaps most encouragingly, we know that we are gathering at a moment in which the collective funding, energy, creativity, and focus across all levels of government, across communities, utility companies, corporate partners, is greater than at any time in recent memory. And through repeated efforts like the upcoming DOE Buildings Upgrade Prize, we will learn to build the coalitions necessary to channel the right resources to the right places in the right ways, and to address community needs in ways that create quality jobs, reduce energy and carbon footprints, and create real and sustainable benefits for those who've historically borne the costs of energy investments without seeing the benefits. These challenges obviously are complex and interconnected, as each of you knows and sees in your daily lives, and the stakes could not be higher. And in response, we look forward to working in coalition and in partnership over the coming months as the R2E2 initiative unfolds. We look forward to working with each of you to understand local needs, to develop comprehensive local approaches, and to implement solutions that meet your community's highest priorities. Thank you very much. It has been really a pleasure and an honor to be part of this, and we look forward to many more conversations like these. Thank you, Annika.
Thank you, Jonathan. We have almost arrived at the end of our time together. So I wanted to take a moment to give a huge thank you to all of the speakers and moderators over the 2 days of this R2E2 Summit, to our amazing interpreters, Anna and Jordy, to our patient and skillful Zoom host, Nick, to Jasmine, who has been in the chat answering your logistical questions, and also to Carolyn Conant, who has been behind the scenes through all of this, and without whom this summit would not have happened, is no exaggeration. Her organizational skills really carried us through. We are so thrilled by the excitement around R2E2 and the turnout for this event. When the summit closes, you'll see a link to an evaluation form that we ask everyone to complete to provide feedback and help us in planning future events and offerings. The form will also be sent to you via email, along with all English and Spanish presentation recordings, slides, the attendee directory, and resources that were shared in the chat within a couple of weeks. Presentation materials will also be available on the R2E2 website, which is acEE.org/R2E2. If you applied for the stipend for community-based organizations, we will contact you after the summit. Stipend availability may be limited based on demand. Also, don't miss these upcoming events from our R2E2 partners. For more educational sessions and networking opportunities, I'll give folks a second just to digest this slide and all the many activities coming up here. And here is a preview of the trainings that R2E2 will be offering to potential applicants to the DOE Buildings Upgrade Prize. Those of you who are with us in our opening this morning heard DOE talk about Buildings Up. This prize will be awarding $22 million in prize money to teams looking to develop building upgrade plans for their communities. All the trainings listed here will be online and open to the public, and a full list of webinars with their official dates and titles will be available soon on DOE's and R2E2's websites. R2E2 is excited to be supporting applicants and working with DOE for this initiative, and we hope to see many of you there. If you would like to save the entire chat from today, I recommend you do that now by clicking the 3 dots next to the smiley face at the bottom of your chat box and selecting Save Chat. Lastly, we will plan to keep you informed about upcoming R2E2 offerings, and you can encourage your partners and colleagues to sign up for updates on our website. Again, that's acEE.org/R2E2. Thank you for being here over the last 2 days. We have been blown away. This summit was carried on the wings of your active engagement and positive energy. Thank you for all that you do to advance affordable housing, climate change goals, racial justice, economic inclusion, and other community needs. Take care and have a wonderful weekend.